Here is the fact that the editors of Ladies' Home Journal buried on page 43 of their February 1951 beauty supplement, tucked between an advertisement for Luster Creme shampoo and a full-page illustration of a woman in a chenille robe gazing at her reflection with an expression of serene self-satisfaction. Soap was ruining your face, and it had probably been doing so since adolescence. Not sometimes. Not under certain conditions. Always. The editorial copy was unambiguous on this point. It stated without qualification that the alkaline residue left by ordinary bar soap disrupted the acid mantle of the skin, stripped protective lipids from the epidermis, and created the very dry patches and fine surface lines that American women were spending millions of dollars each year trying to correct. The terrible irony, the editors pointed out with what reads now as barely concealed glee, was that the correction women applied, more soap, more vigorous scrubbing, simply accelerated the damage. The solution, naturally, was cold cream. A great deal of it, applied in a very particular way, following a very particular sequence at very specific intervals across the day and night. What is remarkable is not that this advice was given. What is remarkable is how detailed, how precise, and how genuinely revolutionary it actually was. Cold cream itself was not a new invention in 1951. The formula attributed to the Greek physician Galen, who blended beeswax, rosewater, and olive oil sometime around the 2nd century, had already been circulating in various commercial permutations for decades by the time the post-war beauty pages took it up with fresh evangelistic urgency. But the 1950s reformulated not just the chemistry of the product, but the entire cultural ritual surrounding its use. Pond's, the brand that had been selling cold cream to American women since the Civil War era, ran advertising campaigns in 1951 that were nothing short of a public health intervention dressed in silk language. Their two-cream system, which the company promoted with a ferocity that bordered on religious instruction, divided feminine facial care into two discrete theological acts. The first, cream for removing makeup and impurities; the second, Pond's Vanishing Cream, for moisturizing the newly clean surface. The advertisements featured women of extraordinary social aspiration, women identified by caption as members of old money families or recent recipients of European educations, each one testifying to the transformation wrought by faithful observance of this protocol. The message was clear: cold cream was not a beauty product. Cold cream was civilization. What the beauty editors of 1951 understood, even if they lacked the precise cellular biology to articulate it, was that post-war American urban life was quietly catastrophic for skin. The factories running at full capacity, the exhaust of a rapidly automobilizing nation, the cheap coal heating systems still installed in most apartment buildings, all of it produced a layer of particulate matter that settled on the faces of women going about their daily lives in ways that ordinary water could not begin to address. A 1951 issue of McCall's beauty department spelled out the problem with startling directness. City air, the copy read, carried invisible particles of industrial residue, soot, and chemical byproduct that embedded themselves in the pores within hours of outdoor exposure. The section then pivoted with perfect editorial timing to a full rundown of which cold cream formulas offered the most effective barrier and cleansing action against these invisible threats. Noxzema, with its distinctive menthol and eucalyptus sting, was positioned as the working woman's solution: efficient, medicinal, no-nonsense. Heinz Honey and Almond Cream targeted the woman who wanted her skincare to also double as a sensory pleasure, something fragrant and comforting applied after a long day. Dorothy Gray's Tissue Cream was marketed in language that suggested surgery avoided, use it faithfully, and you might sidestep the ravages of time altogether, at least for a few more years. But here is where the beauty editors of 1951 moved beyond mere product recommendation and into something genuinely instructive, even radical by the standards of the era. The technique they prescribed was not simply about which product to use. It was about how to use it, how long, in what direction, with what pressure, and in what sequence. And the specificity was extraordinary. Glamour magazine's October 1951 beauty feature dedicated 3 full pages to the mechanics of cold cream application, beginning with a warning that upward strokes, always upward, were non-negotiable. Downward or lateral movements, the editors explained, worked against the direction of natural muscle attachment and could, over years of repetition, contribute to the very sagging and heaviness that women feared. The strokes were to be circular at the temples, outward across the cheekbones, upward along the jawline, and extremely gentle around the orbital bones of the eye. The cream was to sit on the skin for a minimum of 60 seconds before tissue removal, not wiping, which the editors universally condemned as too aggressive, but gentle pressing, which lifted the dissolved makeup and residue without dragging the surface. Some editors recommended a final cold water splash to close the pores. Others, particularly at Harper's Bazaar, where European beauty philosophy carried more prestige, recommended a second cold cream application left on overnight as a sleeping treatment. But what came next would rewrite everything the beauty press thought it understood about the woman reading these pages. The theatrical origins of this cold cream culture were not incidental. The Hollywood studio system, which had been governing the appearance of American femininity through fan magazines, movie posters, and carefully constructed publicity photographs for 2 decades, had long used cold cream as the primary makeup removal tool of the dressing room. Westmore's Beauty Book, the volume produced by the Westmore brothers who served as makeup artists to nearly every major studio in Hollywood, was explicit on this point. Nothing removed theatrical grease paint and cake foundation more completely than cold cream worked gently into the skin and tissued away. When ordinary women read about the skincare habits of their favorite actresses in photoplay and modern screen, they encountered cold cream described not as a drugstore purchase but as a professional tool of the trade, the thing that kept Joan Crawford's complexion camera-ready through 6-day shooting schedules. The aspirational power of this association cannot be overstated. By 1951, cold cream had acquired the glamour of a backstage secret shared between equals. Elizabeth Arden, who had been refining the therapeutic dimensions of skincare for 40 years by this point, understood the cold cream moment with characteristic commercial precision. Her 8-hour cream, introduced years earlier, was finding new relevance in the early 1950s as beauty editors increasingly recommended protective barrier formulas for daytime wear. Arden's Salons, which operated in most major American cities and several European capitals, offered what they called the complete treatment, a multi-step protocol that began with cold cream cleansing and moved through toning, targeted serum application, and finishing moisturization in a sequence that the editors of Vogue described in an admiring 1951 feature as skincare as architecture. Helena Rubinstein, Arden's legendary rival, countered with her own editorial presence, pushing a cream called pasteurized face cream that traded on the era's fascination with scientific language, pasteurization being a process that American women associated with purity and the elimination of invisible threats, a deeply resonant concept in the early Cold War years when invisible threats of various kinds occupied considerable mental real estate. What the beauty editors of 1951 were doing, even as they wrote about lanolin and tissue technique and the correct direction of a fingertip stroke, was something far more consequential than beauty instruction. They were telling women, in the precise technical language of the body, that their faces deserved rigorous attention and methodical care. In a cultural moment when women were being aggressively repositioned as domestic specialists after their wartime workforce participation, the cold cream ritual offered something ambiguous and interesting, a sphere of daily practice that was private, skilled, and entirely their own. No husband audited the tissue removal technique. No social obligation governed the 60-second cream application. This was a woman alone at her vanity mirror, executing a discipline that required knowledge, consistency, and a certain quality of attention that the rest of her day, the cooking, the childcare, the social performance, rarely demanded of her in quite the same way. And hidden in the fine print of the very next column was an admission that no editor of the era expected her readers to catch. The lanolin content of 1951 cold creams deserves particular mention because it was the subject of more editorial column inches than almost any other cosmetic ingredient of the decade. Lanolin, the waxy substance secreted by sheep sebaceous glands and extracted during wool processing, had been used in skin preparations for centuries, but enjoyed a particular vogue in the post-war beauty press as a biological ingredient, something that worked in harmony with the skin's own chemistry rather than imposing synthetic correction upon it. The beauty editors of Mademoiselle ran a two-part series in the spring of 1951 explaining the molecular affinities between lanolin and human sebum, which reads today as surprisingly accurate biochemistry filtered through a poetic sensibility. The piece concluded that lanolin was not simply a moisturizer, but a skin ambassador. A phrase so evocative that it appeared, slightly rephrased, in cold cream advertisements for the next several years. There is a particular passage in the June 1951 issue of Woman's Home Companion that stays with you. The beauty editor, whose name has been largely forgotten by history though her prose has not, wrote directly about what she called the vanity hour, the 20 minutes before bed when a woman sat at her mirror and went through the cold cream ritual with what the editor described as the seriousness due any important act of maintenance. She was not speaking about maintenance of the skin only. She was speaking, obliquely but unmistakably, about maintenance of the self, the deliberate setting aside of the demands of others, the quiet reassertion of one's own physicality, the nightly ritual of tending to one's own face as an act of basic self-regard. Generations of women who read that passage and filed it away somewhere would have understood exactly what she meant, even if neither reader nor writer would have used those particular words for it. The smell of cold cream is one of the most immediately time-specific scents in the entire archive of 20th century personal products. Pond's carried a mild, faintly floral, slightly mineral fragrance that had been calibrated over decades to communicate cleanliness without overwhelming the bedroom where it was most often applied, an environment the product's marketing team clearly understood with considerable intimacy. Noxema's scent was something else entirely, the sharp, almost pharmaceutical sting of camphor, menthol, and eucalyptus that produced a cooling sensation on the skin surface immediately upon application, and that several 1951 beauty editors described as bracing, a word that carried the implication of virtue through discomfort that the era brought to many of its personal care rituals. If Pond's was the scent of feminine refinement, Noxema was the scent of feminine discipline, and the two camps of cold cream devotees in 1951 were, to a certain extent, temperamentally distinct. The Pond's woman was building toward a complexion of soft luminosity. The Noxema woman was conducting a daily audit. Both were engaged in a form of care that the culture around them largely failed to recognize as the skilled practice it genuinely was. What the cold cream ritual also provided, in a decade when the language of mental health was barely available to the women who needed it, was a reliable daily anchor in the physical world, a practice that engaged the hands, the nose, the sight of one's own reflection, and the tactile sense of warm cream on cooled skin, and that organized the close of the day around something that was entirely one's own. The beauty editors of 1951 could not have said this in so many words, but they intuited it, and their enthusiasm for the technical details of the ritual suggests that they understood they were writing about something that mattered beyond the surface of the skin they were addressing. Today we talk about double cleansing as though it were a breakthrough imported from Korean beauty culture. We talk about oil-based cleansers and barrier repair moisturizers and the acid mantle and the microbiome of the skin. We use serums and slugging and occlusives. And none of it, not a single elegant step in the contemporary multi-step skincare routine that fills social media with its earnest devotion, is fundamentally different from what the editors of Ladies' Home Journal were saying on page 43 in February of 1951. They were telling women to cleanse gently, to moisturize generously, to pay attention to technique, and to understand that the skin on their faces was a living surface that responded to consistent, educated care. The products were simpler, the prose was more formal, the photographs were in black and white. But the intelligence behind the instruction and the conviction that a woman's face was worth this particular quality of attention was there in full. It had always been there. Someone just had to say it out loud on the beauty page between the shampoo advertisement and the woman in the chenille robe for everyone to hear. And Volume 2, Power and Puff Lipstick. The chart appeared in the March 1951 issue of Vogue, tucked between a full-page advertisement for Revlon's newest lipstick and a feature on the Paris spring collections, and it presented with the confident authority of a medical diagram 6 distinct female face types: oval, round, square, heart-shaped, oblong, and diamond. Every woman alive, the editors implied, fell cleanly into one of these categories, and once you had identified your category, a corresponding set of makeup corrections, contouring, highlighting, strategic shading, would bring your face into closer alignment with the ideal. That ideal, described once and then never quite directly again, was oval. The oval face required no correction. It was the face that God, or genetics, or extraordinary luck had already provided in perfect form. Everything else, the round face, the square jaw, the too wide forehead, was a departure from this standard that required cosmetic intervention. The beauty editors did not frame this as punishment. They framed it as opportunity. But the chart was unambiguous about which face was the problem and which face was the solution, and millions of American women read it at kitchen tables and in beauty parlor waiting rooms and quietly measured their own reflections against its geometry. What is important to understand about the matinee archetypes of 1951 Grace Kelly and Marilyn Monroe being their supreme poles, the cool blonde classical and the warm blonde feral, is that the Hollywood studio system had not created these ideals by accident. The Westmore brothers, who served as head makeup artists to Warner Brothers, Paramount, Universal, RKO, and essentially every other studio in Hollywood during the 1940s and 50s, had systematized feminine beauty into a technical practice with the precision of industrial engineering. Perk Westmore, working at Warner Brothers, developed a color-coded system for grease paint application that assigned specific foundation shades to specific hair colors and skin undertones. Frank Westmore developed protocols for the correction of perceived facial imperfections using light and shadow. Bud Westmore at Universal worked with actresses to develop what he called the total face, a makeup scheme that was internally consistent and legible from a distance of 40 feet, which was approximately where the cameras were positioned for medium shots. These were not beauty tips, these were engineering specifications. When the beauty editors of 1951 translated these studio techniques for civilian women, they did so with enormous enthusiasm and only moderate accuracy. The difficulty was that the studio techniques had been developed for one specific purpose: to make a human face legible under extremely powerful tungsten arc lights while remaining aesthetically pleasant in the black and white photographic reproduction, and this purpose had very little to do with how a woman's face looked in natural daylight or across a dinner table. Max Factor, whose Pancake Foundation had been developed specifically for 3-strip Technicolor film photography and whose products were marketed to the public with the explicit endorsement of Hollywood actresses, was selling a formulation that had been calibrated for a lighting environment that essentially no ordinary American woman would ever inhabit. The beauty editors knew this, and some of them said so quietly in the small print qualifications that followed the bold studio endorsements. But the aspirational power of the Hollywood connection was too commercially potent to resist, and the corrective techniques continued to be presented as universal wisdom. Grace Kelly, who in 1951 was 22 years old and just beginning to attract serious Hollywood attention after stage work in New York, represented one pole of the mid-century feminine ideal with a completeness that seemed almost self-conscious. Her bone structure, the prominent cheekbones, the clean jawline, the deep-set eyes, was precisely the kind of architecture that the six-face type system identified as requiring little intervention. She was the oval face made flesh, and the beauty editors understood intuitively that the most useful thing they could say about her face was to describe it rather than explain how to approximate it, since approximation, in this case, required the raw material that no cold cream or corrective foundation could provide. The instructions the editors gave for achieving the Kelly effect were therefore focused on what Kelly surrounded her natural architecture with: the restrained palette, the champagne pale foundation that allowed the bone structure to read rather than covering it, the defined but not exaggerated brow, the neutral lip that communicated composure rather than availability. Mademoiselle translated this in its October 1951 beauty feature as the understated authority of the well-bred face, which was a phrase that told American women a great deal about the class aspirations encoded in this particular beauty ideal. But what came next would rewrite everything the beauty press thought it understood about the woman reading these pages. Marilyn Monroe, who in 1951 was also 22 and already a subject of considerable Hollywood publicity machinery even before her breakthrough roles, represented the opposite pole with equal completeness. Her beauty was not architectural but atmospheric, warm, deliberately imprecise at the edges, designed to read as approachable excess rather than composed restraint. Her makeup team, which included the exceptional Alan Snyder, who would remain her primary artist for most of her career, understood that her face was not the six-type chart's oval ideal and had no interest in correcting it toward one. Instead, they worked with the roundness, using highlight and warmth to make the roundness itself into the point. A face that looked as though it had been made by a sculptor who preferred abundance over economy. The bleached platinum hair, the red or pink lip at maximum saturation, the half-closed eyes with their suggestion of private amusement, all of it was the deliberate construction of a woman who appeared to be existing at the edge of a secret. The beauty editors of 1951 were genuinely uncertain how to instruct their readers about this aesthetic because it could not be reduced to the corrective technique of the six-type chart. It was not about subtraction and refinement, it was about addition and warmth. It required, as one glamour editor put it rather helplessly in a November 1951 piece, a particular quality of permission, which is a phrase that has aged into something considerably more interesting than it probably seemed at the time. What very few beauty editors discussed openly in 1951, though the implication ran through every corrective technique article like a watermark, was the racial exclusivity of both archetypes. The matinee ideal, as it existed in the mainstream beauty press, was a white femininity, and the corrective techniques were corrections toward a white normative. The foundation shade ranges sold by Revlon, Max Factor, Coty, and every other major cosmetics manufacturer of the period were built around assumptions about skin tone that excluded, as a practical matter, the majority of women on the planet. The beauty editors of the major national magazines did not address this. It was not a gap in their thinking so much as a structural absence, a category of reader whose existence the editorial framework simply did not acknowledge. Ebony magazine, which had launched in 1945 and was building a sophisticated beauty editorial voice by the early 1950s, addressed this absence directly and with considerable editorial skill, developing its own corrective technique vocabulary and its own set of aspirational archetypes. But the mainstream press, which shaped the dominant cultural narrative about what the improved face looked like, proceeded as though its readership were as monolithic as the six face types suggested. The product that best embodied the democratic aspiration of the corrective technique era, while simultaneously revealing its limitations, was Max Factor's Pancake Foundation, which by 1951 was the best-selling makeup product in the United States and had been for several years. Pancake was revolutionary in the sense that it was the first commercially available matte foundation that could be applied evenly across large surfaces without the streaking and texture variation that plagued the earlier cold cream and powder systems. It photographed magnificently. It held up under stage lights. It was also, in its standard commercial range, available in approximately 12 shades clustered in an extremely narrow band of the full human skin tone spectrum. The beauty editors who wrote about it in 1951 were rapturous about its properties and largely silent about its limitations, except in a few remarkable instances where a particularly honest editor noted in passing that women with deeper complexions might need to experiment to find their best match, a diplomatic formulation that communicated to those paying attention that the product had not been made with them in mind. And hidden in the fine print of the very next column was an admission that no editor of the era expected her readers to catch. The transition from theatrical grease paint to modern cake and cream foundations that was happening in real time in 1951 was genuinely significant, and the beauty editors who covered it understood that they were watching a product category transform. Grease paint, which had been the professional makeup medium of the stage and early film industry, was thick, difficult to control, required significant skill in application, and had to be set with heavy powder to prevent transfer. It was a medium for professionals. Cake foundation and the liquid formulas just beginning to appear in 1951 were designed for amateurs, for the woman at her bathroom mirror with 10 minutes before her husband arrived for dinner. The instruction shifted accordingly. Where earlier beauty editorials had read almost like professional training manuals, the 1951 editions increasingly emphasized speed, simplicity, and the convincing appearance of no effort. The paradox at the heart of mid-century makeup instruction The requirement that enormous effort be expended in order to appear as though no effort had been expended was fully in place by 1951 and was being navigated with varying degrees of acknowledgement by every beauty editor in the country. There is a photograph that appeared in the Harper's Bazaar, May 1951 issue, alongside a feature on the natural face, a concept that the editors were promoting with some urgency that spring d'Indio of a model whose face required, according to the accompanying text, only the lightest touch of powder, a stroke of mascara, and a whisper of rose at the lips. The photograph itself tells a different story. The model's skin is perfectly matte with the even, slightly flattened quality that only a skilled foundation application produces. Her brows are precisely shaped. Her lashes are separated and extended in a way that mascara alone cannot achieve. The natural face was as thoroughly constructed as any other face in the magazine. What the editors were selling, and what the matinee archetypes had taught the culture to want, was not the absence of construction, but the invisibility of it. The lighting question in 1951 beauty editorial deserves considerably more attention than it typically received in the columns themselves. When beauty editors recommended specific foundation shades and specific contouring techniques, they were almost always recommending them for an implied lighting environment that was never explicitly stated. The implied environment was, in most cases, artificial interior light. The tungsten bulbs of the living room, the fluorescent fixtures of the office, the candles of the dinner table, each of which rendered skin color and contour differently, and none of which was the Technicolor studio lighting that had generated the techniques in the first place. The editorial gap between the implied lighting environment and the stated technique was a persistent source of reader confusion that the editors addressed, when they addressed it at all, through the principle of moderation in all things. Use less of the studio technique than you think you need, because what reads as correct under very bright directional light will read as excessive under the softer conditions of everyday life. There was also the matter of the corrective technique's relationship to the wearer's own changing face, the face that looked different in morning light than evening light, different on a well-slept night than an anxious one, different at 22 than at 40. The matinee archetypes of 1951 were, by definition, composed at their best in controlled conditions, preserved in controlled reproductions, and deployed as standards for women living in uncontrolled conditions. The beauty editors who were most honest about this acknowledged that the aspiration to look like a studio photograph was not a reasonable life goal, and that the more useful aspiration was to understand the principles behind the techniques well enough to make them work for one's own specific face in one's own specific light. Today we talk about glass skin and your skin but better and no makeup using the same vocabulary of productive invisibility that the 1951 beauty editors had already perfected. We spend hours on contouring tutorials that teach us to reshape our faces along geometries that would be immediately familiar to the Westmore brothers. We follow influencers who represent the same two poles, the cool architectural blonde and the warm atmospheric brunette, that Grace Kelly and Marilyn Monroe embodied in the first color photographs to make them famous. The 6 face types have expanded to 12 and then to infinite variation, and the explicit corrective language has softened considerably. But the underlying architecture of the conversation, the ideal, the correction, the technique, the before and the after eras has not changed in its essential structure since Vogue published the chart in March of 1951. We are still looking at the oval face in the diagram. We are still, quietly, measuring. Your volume 03, Power and Puff Lipstick. In the spring issue of Mademoiselle 1951, nestled between a spread on capri pants and a very serious article about planning one's trousseau, there appeared an instruction guide for liquid eyeliner application that contained 47 discrete steps. Not instructions, steps. Numbered steps, illustrated with small line drawings, each one corresponding to a specific hand position, wrist angle, degree of arm bracing against the vanity surface, and precise interval between strokes. The editors were not embarrassed about the complexity. The introduction to the piece stated plainly that the perfect winged line was not a natural talent but a learnable skill comparable. The text used this comparison without apparent irony to the proper technique for operating a sewing machine. You practiced, you failed, you blotted the mistake with a cotton ball dipped in cold cream, waited for the lid to settle and began again. Perfection was available to any woman willing to sit with it long enough. The winged eyeliner look that 1951 beauty editors were instructing women to achieve was not a spontaneous fashion development. It had roots that stretched back through Hollywood studio photography, through the theatrical stage traditions of the 19th century, through the Egyptian cosmetic practices that had been making periodic returns to Western fashion consciousness since the Egyptomania of the 1920s. But in 1951, the look was undergoing a specific technological evolution that made it newly achievable for the average woman at home. And the beauty editors understood that this technical shift was the story. The story was not that the wing was beautiful, though they said that too. The story was that there was now a product that made the wing possible without professional training. Liquid liner in a small glass bottle with a fine-tipped brush or pen applicator, sold at drugstores for approximately 60 cents, containing a pigment suspension that dried quickly, resisted smudging with a determination that the earlier cake and pencil formulations had never managed, and produced a line of sufficient precision to articulate the subtle upward angle at the outer corner that transformed a good eye into a great one. Maybelline had been selling eye cosmetics since the 19-teens when T.L. Williams developed the original petroleum jelly and coal dust formula for his sister Mabel, the Mabel for whom the company was named, and the brand had maintained its position as the primary mass-market eye cosmetics company through the 1940s on the strength of its cake mascara and eyebrow products. But the liquid liner category was developing with speed in the early 1950s, and the beauty press was watching closely. Hazel Bishop's work in permanent cosmetics formulation, which had produced the first truly long-wearing lipstick in 1950, was influencing the thinking of every laboratory working on eye products. The question was how to produce a pigment-rich, fine-line applicator that remained workable in the bottle long enough to be commercially viable, but set irreversibly on the skin surface quickly enough to satisfy a woman whose morning routine was already fighting the clock. The solutions arrived in slightly different forms from different manufacturers, but by 1951 the category existed, and the beauty editors were ready to teach it. The technical instruction in 1951 beauty editorial was, by modern standards, astonishingly detailed about the anatomical mechanics of eye makeup. The editors did not simply say, apply liner close to the lash line. They explained in terms that drew on the same rational authority as the corrective foundation technique that the lash line itself was not a straight edge, but a gentle upward curve, and that the liner needed to follow this curve precisely before extending beyond it. They explained that the inner corner of the eye, what the editors called the tear corner, should receive the finest possible line if it was to receive line at all, and that many women with close-set eyes were better served by starting their liner at the pupil's outer edge rather than at the innermost corner. They explained that the extension of the wing should be drawn first as a planned endpoint, a small mark placed at the angle of the intended flick, and then connected back to the lash line rather than drawn outward freehand, which produced inconsistent angles. This was and remains correct advice. It is also the kind of detail that only appears in editorial copy written by someone who had genuinely mastered the technique and thought carefully about why beginners failed. But what came next would rewrite everything the beauty press thought it understood about the woman reading these pages. The social meaning of the focused, precisely lined eye in 1951 was not incidental to the beauty instruction. The editors of Harper's Bazaar and Vogue understood that the eye was the most communicative part of the female face in the cultural vocabulary of the era, and that the choice to define and enlarge it with liner was not a neutral aesthetic decision but a statement about the quality of attention a woman intended to direct at the world around her. The doe eye, wide, clear, with the pupil dramatically framed by a dark line that simultaneously enlarged the apparent iris and sharpened the expression, communicated alertness, presence, and a particular kind of decorative femininity that the post-war moment was coding as appropriate ambition. A woman could not be seen as too clever in 1951 without social risk, but she could be seen as remarkably observant, and the bright, wide-open, beautifully framed eye was the visual emblem of that observational quality. The beauty editors were not naive about this. Several of them said it outright, in the slightly elusive language that mid-century women's magazines had perfected for discussing uncomfortable truths about gender performance. The well-defined eye, wrote one Vogue editor in a November 1951 piece, tells the room that you are paying attention, and this is, in any gathering, a form of power. The brow, which the beauty editors treated as inseparable from the eye in any complete instruction, had its own archaeology in 1951. The thin, highly arched, meticulously plucked brow that had dominated the 1930s, the brow of Jean Harlow and Marlene Dietrich, drawn in a perpetual expression of arch surprise, was giving way by the early 50s to a slightly fuller shape, still emphatically shaped and filled but with more evident natural architecture. Hedy Lamarr, whose engineering intelligence was not yet publicly known, but whose perfect dark brow was the subject of considerable editorial attention, served as the reference point for this transitional look. The editors of Glamour ran a feature in the February 1951 issue on brow shaping that began with the categorical statement that overplucking was the single most aging mistake a woman could make. Aging here meaning not the production of wrinkles, but the visual reminder of previous fashions. A concern that reveals how acutely the beauty press tracked the distinction between timeless and dated. The new brow was to be cleaned at the bottom edge only, allowed to retain its natural upper fullness, filled with a pencil one shade lighter than the actual hair color, and extended slightly past the outer eye to frame the liner application. False lashes occupied a complicated editorial position in 1951. They were available. Individual strip lashes and the more theatrical full strip varieties had been manufactured since at least the 1920s, but the beauty press of the early 50s treated them with ambivalence that reflected the era's deep anxiety about cosmetic authenticity. The corrective technique doctrine was premised on enhancement that read as improvement rather than disguise. False lashes, which added visible material to the face that was transparently not one's own, tested this doctrine severely. Some editors resolved the tension by recommending individual false lashes applied to the outer third of the lash line only, which produced an extension of the natural lash pattern rather than a replacement of it. Others recommended trimming strip lashes to 3/4 length before application. Vogue's position, characteristically, was that false lashes were perfectly acceptable provided they were of the finest quality, full individual lashes of mink or human hair applied with professional adhesive by a trained technician, which was a formulation that made the practice acceptable while making it inaccessible to most of the magazine's readership. And hidden in the fine print of the very next column was an admission that no editor of the era expected her readers to catch. Mascara in 1951 was still primarily a cake formula, the small rectangular pan of compacted pigment sold with a separate brush that required moistening before each use, a system that the editors simultaneously praised for its controllability and criticized for its tendency to produce both over-application and bacterial contamination. Revlon's first mascara and the competing formulas from Maybelline and Max Factor all operated on this principle through most of 1951. The brush was dampened with a drop of water or, as several editors curiously suggested, a drop of the user's own saliva, which has a slightly different surface tension from plain water and produces, in fact, a marginally more even pigment distribution. This recommendation appeared in mainstream beauty editorial without apparent concern, and it probably reflects a moment before the germ theory of cosmetic contamination had fully colonized the consumer's awareness. The editorial instructions for mascara application were specific about the importance of working from root to tip, applying a second coat before the first had fully dried to build volume without adding length, and using a clean toothbrush or fine-toothed comb to separate lashes immediately after application before the formula set. The eye as complete system, liner, brow, mascara, sometimes a soft shadow applied with a fingertip at the outer corner and blended toward nothing, was, in the 1951 beauty press, the central project of the made-up face. The lip was important and the foundation was foundational, but the eyes were where the editors spent the most column inches and the most genuine intellectual energy. They understood, intuitively if not always explicitly, that the eyes were the part of the face that the observer looked at first and returned to most frequently, and that the work done there had an outsized effect on the total impression. They also understood that eye makeup, more than any other category, required real skill to execute correctly and real practice to make consistent, and that the instruction they provided was therefore instruction of actual practical value in a way that the broader aspirational content of the magazine sometimes was not. The shadow play of the 1951 eye did not begin or end with liner. The editors who were most sophisticated in their eye instruction understood that the liner alone, without the contextual support of the brow, the shadow, and the overall skin tone, would read as a graphic element applied to a surface rather than an architectural feature of the face. The shadow, eyeshadow in the modern sense being a category that was, in 1951, still largely expressed in the form of pressed cream or wax-based colours applied with a fingertip rather than the powder shadows and the brush proliferation that came later, was used primarily at the outer corner and in a faint wash across the lid, and the editors were remarkably consistent in their advice to keep it subtle, visible but not assertive, shaping without the shadow becoming its own statement. The argument was that the liner was doing the defining work, and the shadow was doing the softening work, and these were complementary rather than competing functions that needed to be balanced with care. The practice of tight lining, applying pigment along the inner rim of the waterline rather than above the lash line, was mentioned in several 1951 editorial pieces as a technique used in the studio context to intensify the lash appearance from the camera's perspective, and at least 2 editors recommended adapting it for social use with a soft kohl pencil rather than liquid liner, noting that the result was a deepening of the eye's apparent color that read as natural intensity rather than the deliberate construction of the liquid wing. This distinction between the technique that reads as natural and the technique that reads as constructed organized much of the eye makeup instruction of the period and continues to organize it in the tutorials and editorial features of today. What the 47-step eyeliner guide in Mademoiselle was really saying, beneath the numbered steps and the small line drawings and the comparisons to sewing machine operation, was that a woman's face was worth this kind of systematic attention. That the skill required to place a precise line at the outer edge of the eyelid and extend it at a specific angle toward the temple was not trivial, and that the woman who possessed it had earned something, even if what she had earned was largely invisible to anyone who did not know what to look for. Today, we watch tutorial videos on social media that contain more steps than 47, filmed in high definition, and rewound and paused and rewound again until the technique becomes automatic. We spend more money on liquid liner than women in 1951 spent on every cosmetic product combined. We debate the social politics of the cat eye with the same earnestness that the Mademoiselle editors brought to their instruction. The wing has not changed. The aspiration has not changed. What has changed is only the number of people willing to admit that it took them 47 tries to get it right. Chien Volume 4, Power and Puff Lipstick. In March of 1951, the beauty editor of Good Housekeeping published a column that opened with what she clearly intended as practical wisdom and what reads today as a document of breathtaking cultural harm. A woman who could not achieve her ideal weight, defined by the actuarial tables that the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company had published in 1943 and which were being treated by the beauty press as something close to divine revelation, was, the editor wrote, not yet living up to her full potential as a woman, a wife, or a hostess. Not yet living up to her full potential. The phrase did a great deal of work in a small space. It suggested that body weight was a matter of character rather than biology. It implied that the social roles of wife and hostess were contingent on achieving a specific number on a scale. And it positioned the beauty editor as the deliverer of information that would unlock this potential, provided the reader was willing to follow the protocol that occupied the next 2,000 words of the column. The protocol involved, among other things, gelatin. Gelatin was the unlikely star of 1951 diet culture, and the beauty editors who promoted it were operating within a nutritional framework that was, by the standards of the era, genuinely modern. The post-war years had produced a substantial commercial food science apparatus in the United States, and the products that emerged from it, including the flavored gelatin desserts manufactured by Jell-O, Knox, and Royal Dickey, were marketed with scientific language about protein content and digestive ease that the beauty press absorbed and retransmitted to readers who had no particular reason to be skeptical. Gelatin, the editorial logic ran, was a form of protein that the body processed easily without producing the caloric density of meat or the bloating associated with legumes. A gelatin mold made with tomato juice and chopped celery was not, in 1951 editorial language, a sad salad substitute. It was a sophisticated, modern, scientifically informed lunch that demonstrated the hostess's awareness of the latest nutritional thinking. The beauty editors of Ladies' Home Journal, Good Housekeeping, and Woman's Day published gelatin-based diet meal plans with the same editorial seriousness they brought to skincare routines. These were not optional lifestyle suggestions. They were prescriptions. The Metropolitan Life Insurance tables, whose influence on 1951 diet culture cannot be overstated, were a genuinely curious artifact. Developed by actuarial statisticians studying mortality data among policyholders, they had produced weight ranges correlated with longer life expectancy across a population that was neither representative nor particularly healthy by any sophisticated modern measure. The population was largely white, largely male, and entirely composed of people who could afford life insurance in the 1930s and early 40s, a self-selected group whose relationship to food, work, and medical care was entirely unlike the average American woman cooking dinner in a suburban kitchen in 1951. The beauty editors did not know this, and even if they had, the actuarial authority of the tables, the clean authority of numbers produced by insurance companies, would have been difficult to resist in an era that was constructing its sense of female desirability on exactly this kind of scientific-seeming legitimacy. The tables gave beauty editors a number. The number gave them a target. The target gave them a column. The diet advice of 1951 existed in a peculiar cultural overlap between abundance and restriction. The post-war American economy was producing food in quantities that had no precedent in the domestic experience of families who had managed through rationing, and the supermarket aisle of 1951 was, for the first time, genuinely dangerous in its abundance. Canned goods, processed meats, new sugary convenience foods arriving with the speed and persuasiveness of advertising that made the cereal boxes bright and the sandwich bread gleam with enrichment promises. The beauty editors navigated this abundance with a combination of instruction and alarm. They celebrated the modern kitchen's convenience while consistently warning against its excess. The tomato juice and egg yolk breakfast that appeared in multiple 1951 diet plans, tomato juice for its vitamin content and alleged metabolism-stimulating properties, egg yolk for its lecithin and fat-soluble vitamins, was the editor's attempt to impose scientific discipline on a food supply that was becoming difficult to discipline. It was also, it must be said, not particularly pleasant to eat, which was perhaps partly the point. But what came next would rewrite everything the beauty press thought it understood about the woman reading these pages. The reducing salon was a 1951 institution that the beauty editors covered with consistent enthusiasm and only occasional skepticism. These establishments, storefront operations in most mid-sized American cities, typically staffed by women with certificates from correspondence courses in figure correction, offered a range of services designed to address the body in ways that diet alone could not immediately achieve. Steam cabinets enclosed the customer in moist heat while her head protruded through the top, a practice that produced vigorous sweating and was sold as drawing out impurities and releasing retained water. Both claims that were partially accurate in the very narrow sense that steam exposure does produce temporary perspiration while being almost entirely misleading about the lasting effect. Mechanical massage tables vibrated the reclining customer at various frequencies, the theory being that the vibration would break up fat deposits in the same way that a cocktail shaker breaks up ice, a metaphor that appeared in actual editorial copy with apparent sincerity. Rubber reduction suits, worn during exercise or simply during daily activity, compressed the body and produced additional sweating that was sold as inch reduction, exploiting the fact that temporary water loss does produce a measurable decrease in circumference. What the beauty editors almost never discussed in 1951, though the products they were endorsing circled the topic at a careful distance, were the pharmaceutical interventions that were significantly reshaping American women's relationship to their bodies and their appetite during this period. Amphetamine-based weight loss preparations, sold under names including Dexedrine, Benzedrine, and a remarkable variety of trade names that obscured their active ingredient, were being prescribed by American physicians in quantities that constituted a public health phenomenon, and the pep pills or diet pills that appeared with increasing frequency in suburban medicine cabinets were suppressing appetite with biochemical force that no gelatin mold could approach. The beauty editorial of 1951 did not discuss amphetamines directly. The products were prescription, which placed them nominally outside the beauty column's scope. But the weight loss results being achieved in the 1951 moment, the numbers that framed the discussion of ideal bodies, were being produced in part by pharmaceutical intervention that the editorial framing of diet as discipline and character as weight loss simply did not account for. The calorie-counting manuals that high society diet culture had produced in the 1930s and 40s were, by 1951, being democratized through the beauty press into a widely accessible practice. The calorie had been a known nutritional unit since the late 19th century, but the systematic tracking of daily caloric intake as a weight management tool was a specifically mid-20th century American practice, and the beauty editors had adopted it with characteristic thoroughness. Mademoiselle published caloric values for virtually every food item a young American woman might encounter, organized by category and annotated with editorial observations about which foods were worth it and which were not, judgments that were as much aesthetic as nutritional. A scoop of ice cream was worth it, a dinner roll was not, butter on the roll was catastrophic. Cream in one's coffee was a decision that required what the editors called honest daily accounting, a phrase that imported the moral language of bookkeeping into the act of eating, and hidden in the fine print of the very next column was an admission that no editor of the era expected her readers to catch. Dorothea Stanhope, the beauty editor of a mid-tier women's magazine, whose name was not Vogue but whose circulation was in the hundreds of thousands, wrote a piece in the autumn of 1951 that stands out from the rest of the diet editorial of the period for its unusual candor. She noted, in the middle of an otherwise conventional reducing plan, that many of her readers wrote to her not about their weight but about their feelings, specifically about the feeling of being perpetually structurally hungry, not because food was unavailable, but because the diet she and her colleagues were recommending produced chronic undercaloric intake that the body responded to with relentless appetite signals. She acknowledged this. She called it the price of the plan. And then she suggested, in what feels like a genuinely warm and helpless moment of editorial honesty, that her readers might find it useful to drink a large glass of water before each meal, since the sensation of fullness produced by water could briefly satisfy the appetite signals while adding no caloric burden. She did not have the language of caloric restriction physiology. She had the language of a woman who had clearly tried to follow her own column and found it hard. The cottage cheese phenomenon of 1951 deserves recognition as a cultural artifact of the diet moment as complete and revealing as the gelatin mold. Cottage cheese, which had been a relatively minor dairy product through most of the early 20th century, found a new and vigorous identity in the early 1950s as the diet food of medical legitimacy, a high-protein, low-fat, low-calorie substance that the beauty press endorsed with an enthusiasm that the product's actual sensory properties probably did not entirely merit. The beauty editors who published diet plan menus in the spring of 1951 featured cottage cheese in quantities that suggest either a genuine personal conviction about its virtues or a shortage of alternative foods that met the simultaneously high protein and low calorie requirement. It appeared as a lunch portion, as a dinner side, as a breakfast alternative to eggs, and in one particularly memorable McCall's diet plan feature, as a base for a fruit salad that the editor described, in the aspirational prose of the diet column, as refreshing and complete. Refreshing it may have been, complete it was not, in any caloric sense that the physiology of appetite recognized. The reducing salon's more exotic offerings in 1951 included treatments that the beauty editors covered with a combination of genuine curiosity and barely suppressed skepticism. The Faradic current treatment, which passed mild electrical current through surface electrodes placed on the thighs, abdomen, or upper arms, was sold as passive exercise on the theory that the involuntary muscle contractions produced by the current would deliver some portion of the benefit of active exercise without requiring the client to do anything more effortful than lie on a padded table. Several beauty editors tested this personally and reported their findings with scrupulous honesty. The sensation was unusual, sometimes uncomfortable, and the physiological results were, even by the standards of the period, impossible to measure convincingly. This did not prevent the treatment from being widely offered and widely purchased. The psychological dimension of the 1951 reducing salon experience was something that at least two beauty editors addressed with unusual candor. The salon, they noted, functioned partly as a space of accountability, a place where the client's measurements were taken, recorded, and compared to the previous visit's measurements in a way that transformed the abstract goal of weight reduction into a series of concrete numbers with the social visibility of a weekly appointment. This accountability structure, which modern behavioral psychology would recognize as an external commitment device, produced in some women the same focused motivation that regular progress measurements now produce in fitness tracking applications. It also produced, in others, the same demoralization that comes from external measurement of a process that is internally more complex than the measurement can capture. The beauty editors who observed this pattern noted it with a sympathy that suggests they had felt it themselves. There was a strand of 1951 diet advice that exists outside the reducing salon and the gelatin mold framework, and that the mainstream beauty press covered with somewhat less enthusiasm than it deserved. The advice to eat well, consistently, without either restriction or excess, and to regard the body's signals of hunger and satisfaction as reliable guides rather than adversaries to be overridden. This advice appeared, in various forms, in the work of several nutrition writers who contributed to the women's magazines of the period, and it was accurate in a way that the gelatin mold menus were not. It was also considerably less commercially interesting than the gelatin mold, which generated product sales, advertising revenue, and the perpetual return visit of the reader who was still, after all these years, trying to get it right. There is a melancholy that sits at the heart of the 1951 diet editorial that the editors themselves were too close to see clearly. They believed with apparent sincerity that the information they were providing would make women's lives better, that the gelatin molds and the reducing salons and the caloric accounting were tools of female empowerment in the sense that they gave women agency over a body that the culture was evaluating with painful explicitness. They were not wrong entirely. Information is agency, even imperfect information, but the framework within which that information operated, the metropolitan life tables, the ideal weight that correlated with full potential, the column inches devoted to the correction of bodies that were simply bodies, was one that extracted an enormous psychological cost from its practitioners. Today we have eating disorder awareness campaigns and intuitive eating frameworks and body neutrality movements that are, in their best versions, doing exactly the work that the Good Housekeeping beauty editor of 1951 could not have imagined needing to do. We are still counting. We are also finally beginning to ask what exactly we are counting toward. In Volume 5, Power and Puff Lipstick. There is a sentence in the October 1951 issue of Glamour magazine, printed in the same matter-of-fact tone used to announce train schedules, that has been lodged in the historical memory of mid-century beauty culture ever since it was written. The beauty editor, addressing the question of how a woman could maintain an attractive appearance during the working week without daily salon appointments, stated that a properly set head of pin curls, applied on Sunday evening and maintained through the week with careful overnight pinning and disciplined morning brushing, could sustain an attractive style for as many as 5 consecutive days, and that a woman who failed to achieve this was simply not setting her curls correctly. The sentence is remarkable not for its instruction, which was accurate, but for its confidence. The suggestion that physics-defying architectural hair maintenance was a skill failure rather than a structural impossibility is pure 1951. The pin curl was, at its most fundamental, an exercise in applied geometry. A lock of hair wound around itself at the scalp into a flat circular coil and secured with a metal clip or bobby pin would dry in the curved form imposed upon it and release when brushed out as a wave or a loose curl depending on the diameter of the coil and the direction of the wind. Smaller diameter coils, pinched flat against the skull, produced tight marcelled waves when brushed. Larger coils, wound loosely, produced the soft rolling curls that framed the mid-century face with their gentle bounce. The direction in which the curl was wound, clockwise or counterclockwise, determined whether the brushed-out hair would sweep toward the face or away from it, and a skilled pin curler could map the entire head in advance so that the brushed-out result produced exactly the silhouette she intended. This mapping process, which the beauty editors of 1951 took very seriously, was the intellectual heart of the art. It required spatial reasoning, an understanding of how hair behaved under tension and heat, and a well-trained set of hands that could replicate the same section sizes and coil tensions across 90 or more individual curls without losing consistency. The products that supported the ritual occupied their own significant corner of the 1951 beauty market, and the beauty editors covered them with the same analytical attention they brought to skincare formulations. Setting lotions, clear or slightly tinted solutions containing synthetic resins and plasticizers that coated the hair shaft and stiffened it enough to hold the curl shape through the drying process, were the essential first step, and the market for them was competitive. Toni Home Permanent had captured enormous public attention in the late 1940s with its revolutionary at-home cold wave permanent solution, which eliminated the need for salon chemical processing. But by 1951, the permanent wave, whether salon or home applied, was positioned by beauty editors as a foundation rather than a styling tool. You got the permanent to give the hair's natural state a wave pattern it wouldn't otherwise hold. You used the setting lotion and pin curls to refine and update that foundation week to week, adjusting the set direction and tension to create slightly different looks from the same underlying structure. Toni's advertising in 1951 featured pairs of women, one with a salon permanent, one with a home Toni permanent, and challenged readers to tell them apart, a campaign whose confidence was largely warranted. The metal clips used for pin curl setting were objects of considerable functional importance that the beauty press treated with the seriousness they deserved. A well-made pin curl clip, usually chromium-plated steel with a spring mechanism that applied consistent pressure without kinking or bending the coil, was a small engineering achievement. Cheaper clips left marks in the curl, produced inconsistent pressure that caused the coil to dry with flat spots, and had spring mechanisms that weakened with repeated use and produced clips that held the curl poorly toward the end of a long overnight set. The beauty editors recommended replacing clips regularly, storing them in a small tray or dish, rather than dropping them loose in a drawer where the mechanisms caught on each other and weakened, and washing them occasionally in warm, soapy water to remove the product buildup that accumulated after repeated use. This was the kind of instruction that revealed how seriously the ritual was taken, the care of the tools, not just the execution of the technique. But what came next would rewrite everything the beauty press thought it understood about the woman reading these pages. Sleeping in pin curls was a matter of practical accommodation that the beauty editors addressed with varying degrees of frankness. The standard overnight set required the hair to be divided, wound, clipped, and then covered with a hairnet, a fine mesh covering that held the entire arrangement secure during the inevitable movements of sleep, prevented the pillow from disturbing individual curls, and absorbed some of the overnight humidity that could disrupt the set. The hairnet of 1951 was not a fashion object. It was a tool, usually made of fine rayon or synthetic fiber in a shade matching the user's hair color, sold in flat packets at every 5 and dime in the country for a few cents. The beauty editors were candid about the fact that sleeping in a full pin curl set was not comfortable, that the clips produced pressure points at the scalp that some women found significantly disruptive to sleep, and that the solution to this, wearing the clips less tightly, produced inferior curl definition in the morning. Some editors recommended satin pillowcases as a partial compromise, since the reduced friction of satin against the hairnet allowed the head to move slightly without disturbing the set. The satin pillowcase recommendation is one of those cases where the beauty advice of 1951 converges perfectly with what dermatologists and hairstylists now recommend for exactly the same reasons. The Saturday morning appointment at the beauty parlor was the institutional alternative to the home pin curl ritual, and the beauty editors of 1951 treated these two practices as complementary rather than competing. The beauty parlor, neighborhood establishments staffed by trained cosmetologists who operated under state licensing requirements that had been gradually strengthened through the 1930s and 40s, offered professional wet sets and styling that produced results most women could not replicate at home, and the weekly or fortnightly salon appointment was a social institution of considerable importance in the lives of American women across most economic levels. The beauty press understood this. Glamour ran a feature in the spring of 1951 that described the beauty parlor not as a service environment, but as a women's club without dues, noting that the conversational freedom of the salon, the topics discussed between stylist and client, the gossip exchanged across dryer hoods, the mutual witnessing of transformation, constituted a social space that had no equivalent in the rest of the organized social life available to the average American woman of the period. The chemistry of the setting lotion formulations that occupied the middle shelves of drugstore displays in 1951 was, by any rigorous standard, fascinating. The resins used, polyvinyl alcohol being among the most common, were the same class of synthetic polymer-finding applications across dozens of post-war industries simultaneously, from paint formulation to packaging film. When a beauty editor in 1951 recommended that a reader spray a fine mist of setting lotion onto each section of hair before winding it into a coil, she was recommending the application of a dilute polymer solution that would, upon drying, form a thin, flexible film around each individual hair shaft and hold the curved position imposed on it. This was not a folk remedy. This was applied polymer chemistry, and it worked for exactly the reasons that the polymer chemists who had developed the formulation intended it to. The beauty editors of the era were not trained chemists, but the better ones had enough scientific literacy to explain the principle to their readers in terms that made sense. The lotion gives the hair something to hold onto as it dries, just as a framework gives a building something to hold onto against the weather. And hidden in the fine print of the very next column was an admission that no editor of the era expected her readers to catch. What the pin curl ritual provided, beyond the physical outcome of bouncy, neatly groomed hair, was something that the beauty editors occasionally acknowledged and frequently implied, a reliable daily ceremony of deliberate attention. The Monday through Friday maintenance of the Sunday set, the careful repinning before bed each night, the net replacement, the morning brushing with its particular technique of section-by-section release and directional shaping, was a practice that structured the day at both its beginning and its end. It gave a woman, in a decade when the domestic labor of homemaking was being vigorously repositioned as non-work, a daily task that required genuine skill and produced a visible, verifiable result. The hair was either right or it was not, and if it was right, the woman who had set it knew exactly why. The Toni Home Permanent's cultural significance in 1951 cannot be reduced to the practical value of the product, though the practical value was genuine and considerable. The Toni represented something larger, the first major incursion of a professional beauty service into the domestic space, the conversion of a process that had required a licensed cosmetologist, professional equipment, and a salon appointment into something that could be accomplished in an ordinary kitchen with a kit purchased at a drugstore. The beauty press of the period was divided about this development in ways that reveal the complexity of the relationship between the professional beauty industry and the domestic beauty culture it served and competed with simultaneously. The salon operators, through their trade publications and occasional letters to the consumer press, argued that the Home Permanent produced inferior results and potential scalp damage. The beauty editors of the consumer magazines, who were ultimately writing for the woman at home rather than the woman at the salon, evaluated the product by the standard of what it delivered to the consumer and largely concluded that, executed according to the instructions and with appropriate caution, it delivered a great deal. The smell of the Toni waving solution was a specific olfactory memory that a generation of American women carried long after the era. The ammonium thioglycolate compound that broke the hair's disulfide bonds, the chemical mechanism that allowed the hair to be reformed into a new pattern before the neutralizer rebuilt those bonds in the curved position, produced a pungent, slightly sulfurous smell that the Home Permanent's advertising and packaging did nothing to address, and that the beauty editors handled with their characteristic combination of pragmatism and good humor. One editor described it as the scent of personal improvement, which is a phrase that manages to be simultaneously ironic and sincere in the manner that the best 1951 beauty writing achieved regularly. The sociology of the beauty parlor appointment that the Home Permanent disrupted was more complex than the straightforward economics of saved salon fees suggested. The beauty parlor, for the women who visited it weekly or fortnightly in 1951, was not simply a service environment. It was, as the glamour editors had noted in their spring piece on the Women's Club Without Dues, a space with social functions that the Home Permanent could not replicate. The dryer hood that sat over a setting customer's head for 20 to 40 minutes while her set dried was a specific social container, semi-private, comfortable enough for relaxed conversation, positioned adjacent to another customer in an equivalent container, and perfectly calibrated for the kind of sustained, intimate conversation between women who were regular clients of the same stylist that was available in few other social contexts of the period. You could say things under the dryer hood that you could not say at the dinner table or the bridge club or the church social. The stylist who stood at the center of this network, moving between stations, absorbing information and occasionally, carefully redistributing it, was a figure of genuine social importance in the community she served. The Toni Home Permanent was excellent value, but it had no dryer hood. The morning brushing ceremony that completed the pin curl set was, for many women, the most genuinely pleasurable moment in the entire ritual cycle. The section-by-section release of the clips, the gentle separation of the coils with the fingers before the brush touched them, the long brushing strokes that converted the tight, disciplined geometry of the overnight set into the soft, mobile, bouncing waves of the finished style. This was a process with a satisfaction that the beauty editors described regularly and with obvious feeling. The hair that emerged from the brushing was different in quality from hair styled any other way. It had a density and a movement that reflected the care invested in setting it, and the woman who saw it in her mirror at 7 in the morning before her day had properly begun was seeing evidence of her own competence in a form that was immediate, visible, and unambiguously hers. Today we talk about hair care with a biological specificity that 1951 lacked. We know about the cuticle layer, the cortex, the hydrogen bonds broken by water and reformed by heat, the protein structure that gives hair its mechanical properties. We have diffusers and ionic dryers and ceramic rollers and sleeping caps designed with precisely calibrated interior textures. We have returned, in the heatless curl tutorials that circulate endlessly on social media, to the fundamental insight of the pin curl. That hair held in a curved position while wet will dry in that curve and release into something beautiful. The tools have changed, the chemistry has been clarified, the social arrangements that made the Sunday evening set a multi-hour necessity have shifted considerably. But the woman sitting at her mirror in 2026, dampening sections of hair and wrapping them around fabric rods and pinning the end, is doing something that her counterpart in 1951 would recognize without a single word of explanation. Volume 6. Power and Puff Lipstick. The advertisement appeared in the September 1951 issue of Harper's Bazaar, and it made a promise that was, by any realistic assessment, extraordinary, that 8 weeks of enrollment in the Patricia Stevens Finishing and Career School would transform any young woman, regardless of her current social circumstances, into someone who could walk into any room in America and belong there. Not be tolerated in it, not be granted provisional access to it, belong there with the effortless conviction of someone who had always belonged and could not be made to feel otherwise. The fee for this transformation was $55, payable in installments. The beauty editors who covered the finishing school industry in 1951 were not naive about what was being sold, and the very best of them articulated the distinction between the real content of charm education, the specific learnable techniques of physical deportment, conversational management, and social navigation, and the more grandiose promise of the advertisement with admirable precision. But they also believed, and said so, that the techniques were real, that they worked, that the posture improved by balancing a book on one's crown was, in fact, improved posture, that the social confidence produced by knowing the correct grammar of a formal introduction was, in fact, social confidence. The Patricia Stevens schools, which had been expanding through the late 1940s and had multiple locations by 1951, were the best known, but by no means the only institutions of their kind. The John Robert Powers School, founded by the modeling agency head who had also developed the first systematic body measurement standards for the modeling industry, offered finishing courses alongside its professional training. The Catherine Gibbs School, which had a distinguished reputation primarily for its secretarial training, operated a strong deportment and social etiquette curriculum that its administrators understood was as important as shorthand to the career prospects of its graduates. The beauty editors of 1951 covered all of these institutions with a combination of practical instruction and sociological analysis that represents some of the most interesting journalism in the women's magazines of the period. The Book on the Crown exercise, which has become the iconic shorthand for finishing school instruction in the cultural memory of the era, was in the curriculum for a reason that the better charm school directors explained with satisfying clarity. Balancing a volume on the head while walking, sitting, and rising required the maintenance of a specific relationship between the skull and the cervical spine, a relationship that, when habituated through practice, produced not only the upright carriage that the exercise was designed to develop, but also a specific quality of movement throughout the body. When the head is correctly aligned over the spine, the shoulders drop naturally to their correct position rather than rounding forward. When the shoulders are in their correct position, the chest opens rather than compressing. When the chest opens, the breathing deepens automatically. The deportment teachers of 1951 were teaching, in the language of social elegance, something that resembled what we would now call somatic awareness, the conscious relationship between posture and state, between physical arrangement and social projection. The beauty editors who wrote about it understood the connection. She holds herself as though she expects to be looked at, one Harper's Bazaar feature noted of a Patricia Stevens graduate, and so she is. The grammar of formal social introduction, which occupied significant curriculum space in the 1951 charm school, had a complexity that the uninitiated found genuinely surprising. The rules governing who was introduced to whom, younger to older, lower ranked to higher ranked, men to women in most circumstances, though with specific exceptions when the man was of substantially higher social station, were not arbitrary. They encoded a social logic about priority and acknowledgement that had been refined through European court protocol and American social practice over centuries, an understanding that logic made the rules both easier to remember and easier to adapt when the rules themselves did not perfectly fit the situation at hand. The beauty editors who explained these protocols in their columns consistently made this distinction. They were not teaching readers to memorize rules. They were teaching them to understand the underlying principle of social acknowledgement from which the specific rules derived. But what came next would rewrite everything the beauty press thought it understood about the woman reading these pages. The conversational curriculum of the charm schools addressed something that the beauty editors found fascinating: the management of social silence. The terror of the conversational pause, the moment when a topic exhausted itself and the gathering waited for someone to introduce a new one, was identified by the charm school directors as the most common source of social anxiety among their students, and the techniques developed to address it were genuinely sophisticated. The standard advice of the era was to prepare 3 or 4 opening conversational gambits before any social engagement. Specific questions about recent events, observations about shared experiences, neutral but engaging subjects like travel, music, or the arts that could draw in strangers without requiring shared history. But the better charm school directors went beyond this, teaching their students to develop a kind of conversational peripheral vision, a habit of attention to the social group that identified which topics were producing engagement, which were producing polite endurance, and when a shift was needed. This was not a social script. It was a skill of reading, and the beauty editors who covered it were rightly impressed. Posture at the dining table received its own distinct curriculum in the finishing schools, and the beauty editorial coverage of this instruction reveals how much the mid-century social world was structured around the dinner table as a performance space. The correct relationship between spine, seat, and table, back supported but not slouched, elbows clear of the cloth but hands available, the body turned fractionally toward the conversational partner to signal attention, was practiced until it became automatic because the dinner party of 1951 was among the most high-stakes social settings available to the women who attended finishing school. This was where husbands were impressed, mothers-in-law assessed, and business relationships that moved through domestic channels rather than professional ones were established and maintained. The beauty editors who covered the charm school curriculum were not simply reporting on social niceties, they were documenting a system of social navigation that was, for the women who participated in it, genuinely consequential. The irony that permeated the charm school enterprise, and that the most honest beauty editors were willing to name, was that the social polish being systematically taught at $55 a course was already possessed, apparently effortlessly, by women whose families had been training them in it since childhood. The finishing school was selling, to women who had not grown up in the social environments that produced these behaviors naturally, a compressed version of what their social superiors had received over a lifetime of dinner parties, adult modeling, and gentle correction. The very existence of the finishing school curriculum was, in this sense, an implicit acknowledgement of the class architecture of American social life, the recognition that entry into certain social registers required not just wealth or intelligence, but a specific set of embodied behaviors that had to be learned somewhere, and that if they hadn't been learned at the family dining table, they could be approximated at a school in a commercial building. The beauty editors did not always draw this analysis explicitly, but it was present in the structure of what they reported, and the most perceptive readers would have felt it, and hidden in the fine print of the very next column was an admission that no editor of the era expected her readers to catch. The Catherine Gibbs deportment curriculum had one particular element that appeared in beauty editorial coverage with enough frequency to suggest genuine fascination: the telephone voice exercise. Students practiced telephone conversations with instructors who could not see them, developing the vocal quality, the pace, the diction, the management of pauses that communicated competence and composure without the supporting visual information of physical presence. This was not an incidental skill in 1951. The telephone was increasingly important in both professional and social life, and the way a woman sounded on a telephone line was a significant part of her professional and social impression. The beauty editors who reported on this exercise noted with approval that the same vocal qualities the exercise developed, measured pace, clear articulation, a slight forward placement of the voice that carried through telephone distortion, also improved public speaking and social presentation generally. They were right. The voice training component of the charm school curriculum, which received considerably less editorial coverage than the posture and social grammar instruction, was in some ways the most practically significant. American regional accents in 1951 were more distinct than they are today. The great vowel shift had not yet been homogenized by television and national media to anything like the degree that it subsequently would be, and the accent of one's upbringing carried information about class, geography, and education that the educated listener decoded immediately. The charm schools understood this and offered accent modification instruction that the beauty editors of the national magazines covered with the careful neutrality of people aware that they were writing for readers from every American region. The instruction was not, the editors consistently noted, about eliminating regional character from speech, which would be both impossible and undesirable. It was about eliminating the specific vowel narrowings and consonant elisions that the American educational system had come to code as markers of limited education, regardless of whether they actually indicated anything of the kind. The walking instruction, how to cross a room, how to descend a staircase, how to exit an automobile with composure, was covered in the charm school editorial with the detail it deserved, which was considerable. The automobile exit was a particular preoccupation in 1951, since the expanding car culture of the post-war years meant that more women than ever were navigating the social transition from the car to the public space, a transition that the low-slung bodies and wide bench seats of the period made physically awkward in a full skirt with crinolines. The technique recommended by Patricia Stevens' instructors, turning sideways on the seat before exiting, placing both feet on the curb in unison before rising, was both physically sensible and visually composed, preventing the alternative, which was an ungainly pivot that caused the skirts to ride and the petticoats to show. The beauty editors who covered this instruction took evident pleasure in its specificity. Here was practical advice, immediately applicable, that solved a real daily problem with the elegance of technique. The mirror exercises that the charm schools used to develop the student's awareness of her own physical presentation were a form of biofeedback training before the term existed. Students were directed to perform various social actions, entering a room, making an introduction, rising from a chair, accepting an offered hand, while watching themselves in a full-length mirror, developing the ability to see their own movement from the outside perspective, rather than experiencing it purely from within. This exercise produced, according to the charm school directors who discussed it in editorial interviews, two distinct outcomes. In some students, it produced immediate, corrective self-consciousness. They saw immediately what was awkward or closed or hesitant in their movement and were motivated to adjust. In others, it produced the opposite of the intended effect, an increase in self-conscious uncertainty rather than a decrease, as the student became so aware of her own watching that natural movement became impossible. The best instructors, the beauty editors noted, could diagnose which response a student was having and modify the exercise accordingly, moving the mirror to a peripheral position or removing it entirely and substituting verbal feedback for the students whose self-consciousness the mirror amplified rather than corrected. The etiquette of the written social note, the thank you letter, the letter of introduction, the note of condolence, the invitation, acceptance or regret received dedicated curriculum space in the finishing schools that the beauty editors covered with the attention it deserved. In 1951, before the telephone had entirely displaced written correspondence as the preferred medium for social communication between women, the ability to produce a well-phrased, correctly formatted, appropriately timed social note was a genuine social skill with real consequences for the writer's social standing. The charm schools taught the correct forms: the third-person regret letter for formal invitations, the first-person note for personal correspondence, the timing window for thank you notes, the specific language of condolence that avoided the more egregious clichés of the form dates, with the same systematic attention they brought to the grammar of verbal introduction. The beauty editors who covered this instruction included sample language that readers could use directly, which was a form of practical editorial service that the readers of 1951 appreciated and that distinguished the better charm school features from the more abstract social advice that filled the etiquette columns. What the finishing school system of 1951 was ultimately encoding, and what the beauty editors were documenting without always fully naming, was a set of cultural permissions granted to the woman who had demonstrably mastered its conventions. The woman who held herself well, spoke clearly, wrote correct thank you notes, and made graceful introductions had signaled her fluency in the social language of the aspirant middle and upper middle class, and this signal opened doors in the specific way that social signals do, not by guaranteeing anything but by removing the surface frictions that prevented genuine engagement. The polish was not the substance, but in 1951, as now, the polish determined whether the substance got its opportunity. What the charm school graduates of 1951 received at its best was not the artificial social confidence of a memorized routine, but something more durable, the specific reassurance that comes from knowing the rules well enough to work within them and around them with conscious intention. The woman who knew the grammar of formal introduction was not constrained by it, she was freed by it, in the same way that a musician who has thoroughly mastered music theory is freed to improvise beyond it. Today, we talk about soft skills and emotional intelligence and executive presence in professional development seminars that charge many times what Patricia Stevens charged in 1951. The content, posture, conversational awareness, social reading, the management of first impressions has not fundamentally changed. What has changed is that we no longer frame these skills as specifically feminine, which is one of the most significant improvements in the conversation since the charm school era. The skills were never feminine. They were human. The 1951 curriculum was simply teaching them to women, and not always without strings attached. Volume 7. Power and Puff Lipstick. Charlotte Winchester, the beauty editor of a large circulation American women's magazine that shall be identified only as one of the 4 that competed vigorously for subscribers in 1951, wrote in her November column a sentence that has been quoted by compact collectors ever since and that still commands a certain authority over anyone who has ever examined a beautifully made powder case at close range. A woman who opens a fine compact at a restaurant table is not checking her appearance. She is announcing her taste. The distinction matters. Checking your appearance is a nervous act, a correction, an admission that something might be wrong. Announcing your taste is a confident act, a declaration, a small display of the aesthetic sensibility that governs your choices in the visible world. Winchester understood that the compact was not primarily a delivery mechanism for pressed powder. It was an object of personal theatre, and the theatre it staged was one of considered self-presentation, performed for the pleasure of the performer as much as for the observation of the audience. The powder compact of 1951 existed in a market that ranged from 5 and dime pressed metal cases selling for 39 cents to hand-painted Limoges porcelain cases with gold vermeil fittings that cost more than most American women's monthly grocery budgets. The beauty editors navigated this range with the tact of diplomats, finding language that honored the aesthetic achievement of the finest examples while making the enterprise accessible to the reader who was working with a drugstore budget. The vocabulary they developed for discussing compact quality, the heft of the base metal, the click of the closure mechanism, the depth of the mirror, the softness of the powder puff sewn inside, was borrowed partly from jewelry criticism and partly from a specifically feminine tradition of object evaluation that had no parallel in any masculine equivalent, since men were not, in 1951, expected to carry small decorative objects of personal maintenance and to have opinions about them. Stratton of England, which had been manufacturing compacts since the 1920s and had developed the powder door compact design, a case in which the powder section opened independently from the mirror lid, allowing the user to access her powder with one hand without the full compact opening and risking the cascade of powder dust across a silk blouse, was by 1951 considered the gold standard of functional compact design among beauty editors on both sides of the Atlantic. American beauty editors who covered accessories with any seriousness always mentioned Stratton when the subject of compact quality arose, and the particular mechanism of the powder door received enthusiastic editorial attention as an engineering solution to a genuinely practical problem. The Stratton compact was not the most glamorous object in the vanity case. It was the most intelligent, and the distinction was worth making in 1951, when women's practical intelligence in the design of their own objects was not always a given. Coty, the French fragrance house that had established an American manufacturing presence and was producing both its classic Le Mans powder and the popular air-spun loose powder line, marketed its compacts in the early 1950s with a sophistication of design that the beauty editors found difficult to resist. The Coty compact cases of the period were not fine jewelry objects in the Stratton sense, but they were thoughtfully made, enameled in the season's colors, embossed with geometric or floral motifs that matched the graphic language of the fragrance packaging, and sold as sets that coordinated the compact with the lipstick case and perfume bottle in a way that constituted a complete accessory system. The concept of the matched set appealed powerfully to the 1951 aesthetic sensibility, which valued coordination and completeness with an intensity that the subsequent decades would largely abandon. "A woman's accessories," wrote one Vogue editor in 1951, "should speak to each other." And the Coty sets allowed them to do so in the same accent. But what came next would rewrite everything the beauty press thought it understood about the woman reading these pages. The question of when and how it was socially appropriate to use a powder compact in public was treated by the 1951 beauty press with a seriousness that reveals the social weight attached to the act. Reapplying powder at the restaurant table, as opposed to excusing oneself to the powder room for any more substantial cosmetic adjustment, was acceptable, even elegant, provided it was done with economy and discretion. A brief opening of the case, a light application with the puff, a moment of examination, a decisive closure. It was not acceptable to apply rouge in public, to touch up lipstick without first blotting the existing color, or to examine one's reflection for longer than approximately 3 seconds in any social setting where other people might observe the examination and interpret it as self-consciousness rather than maintenance. The specific duration of the mirror examination, 3 seconds, appeared in one etiquette guide that was referenced in beauty editorial with enough frequency to be considered canonical. 3 seconds, one quick assessment, one correction, if required. Closure. Move on. The psychology of the compact as a portable sphere of privacy deserves consideration that the 1951 beauty editors occasionally approached and then tactfully redirected. The act of opening a compact in a social setting was, among its other functions, a brief withdrawal from the social flow, a moment in which the woman's attention was directed inward, at her own reflection, rather than outward at the people around her. In a cultural moment when the performance of total social availability was a significant expectation placed on women in most social settings, this brief culturally sanctioned withdrawal had a meaning that went beyond powder application. The compact was permission, specific, bounded, publicly legible permission, to look at yourself for 3 seconds without apology. Several beauty editors of the period seem to have understood this, though they expressed it in the careful language of etiquette rather than the language of psychology. The compact, one editor wrote, gives a woman a moment of private accounting in public space. This is a very precise formulation for something that the writer was probably not thinking about in those exact terms. The collector market for vintage compacts that flourished in the later decades of the 20th century, organized clubs, specialist dealers, illustrated reference guides devoted entirely to the identification and valuation of specific manufacturers and designs, had its roots in the period attachment that 1951 women formed to particularly fine examples. The compact was one of the few categories of personal object in which a woman of 1951 might invest genuine connoisseurship, developing preferences, understanding manufacturers, recognizing quality distinctions, accumulating examples across a range of price points with the same logic that governed the acquisition of any collection. The beauty editors who covered compacts as accessories rather than simply as cosmetic delivery systems were implicitly validating this connoisseurship, treating the objects as worthy of the same analytical attention given to jewelry or ceramics. And hidden in the fine print of the very next column was an admission that no editor of the era expected her readers to catch. Evening in Paris, the extraordinarily successful fragrance and cosmetics line manufactured by Bourjois and sold in its characteristic cobalt blue packaging throughout the 1940s and 50s occupied a curious position in the compact market. It was widely available, modestly priced, and possessed of a romantic visual identity, the deep blue case with its silver lettering, the name itself with its suggestion of sophisticated escape that made it function aspirationally well beyond its actual price point. The beauty editors covered Evening in Paris with a slightly different register than they brought to Stratton or Coty, acknowledging its accessibility while noting the specific pleasures of the blue packaging with a warmth that reads today as entirely genuine. The Evening in Paris compact appeared on Christmas lists in beauty editorial gift guides, in gifts for under $3 roundups, and in features on the democratization of cosmetic elegance with a consistency that suggests it occupied a particular affective space in the 1951 beauty conversation, the accessible luxury, the small thing that made the everyday feel special. The Elgin American Compact, produced by the Elgin National Watch Company in its diversified manufacturing period, occupied a distinct position in the 1951 compact market that the beauty editors occasionally addressed when covering the broader accessories category. Elgin American cases were produced in pressed metal with a quality of tooling that reflected the company's watchmaking heritage. A precision in the engraving of floral and scroll motifs, a consistency in the plating finishes, a functionality of hinge and clasp mechanism that was above the drugstore standard without reaching the handcrafted quality of the finest English or French makers. They occupied the middle space of the market with considerable grace, and the beauty editors who mention them generally did so in the context of the gift purchase. The compact that could be given to a young woman without embarrassment by someone who could not afford the Stratton but understood that the 39-cent pressed tin case was an insufficient expression of regard. The ritual of the compact refill was a dimension of compact culture that the beauty editors addressed with practical instruction that reveals how seriously the compact was taken as an ongoing investment rather than a disposable purchase. A quality compact case was designed to outlast its powder fill by many years, and the loose powder and pressed powder refills sold by the major cosmetics manufacturers were produced in the standard dimensions of the most popular compact interior dimensions to facilitate this practice. Coty, Yardley, and several other houses sold powder refills explicitly labeled for use in their own compact cases, but the better compact manufacturers also supplied refill blanks that could accept powder from a wider range of sources. The beauty editor who devoted column space to the compact refill was making an argument, implicit but clear, for the compact as a long-term relationship rather than a seasonal purchase, and this argument was embedded in a broader 1951 aesthetic philosophy about the desirability of objects that improved or at least maintained their integrity through extended use. The enamel compact, which represented a distinct category from the metal-finished cases, was covered by the beauty editors in the language of the decorative arts, because the finest enamel compacts were, by any fair assessment, objects of decorative art rather than simply cosmetic containers. The cloisonné and champlevé enamel techniques applied to compact surfaces, the former using fine wire partitions to separate areas of colored glass enamel, the latter cutting the metal base itself to create recessed channels that were then filled with enamel and ground flush, produced surfaces of jewel-like color and complexity that required the same trained hand skills as fine jewelry enameling. The beauty editors who knew the difference mentioned it, and the readers who collected quality enamel compacts understood that they were collecting within a craft tradition with genuine historical depth. Tiffany and Cartier produced compact cases in this period, occasionally for the top end of the market, that were unambiguously jewelry objects that happened to contain pressed powder, and the beauty editorial coverage of these pieces understood them in those terms. The particular pleasure of the sound of a quality compact, the precise, resonant click of the closure mechanism engaging, was mentioned by multiple beauty editors in 1951 as a quality indicator second only to visual inspection. A compact that clicked cleanly, with a brief sound of sufficient depth to indicate substantial base metal and a well-tensioned spring, was a compact whose mechanism would remain reliable through years of daily use. A compact that produced a thin, tinny sound, or worse, that closed with the soft, dampened sound of inadequate spring tension announced its own impermanence. The editors who included this detail were writing about the compact as an acoustic object as well as a visual and tactile one, and in doing so were recognizing that the quality of daily use objects is experienced through multiple senses and that the full sensory profile of a well-made thing is part of what makes it worth having. The powder puff inside the compactoire, usually a small circle of chamois leather or soft fabric attached to an elastic loop that allowed it to be held between two fingers for application, was replaced by the beauty editor's recommendation at the first sign of cosmetic buildup or texture deterioration, not because the compact itself was worn, but because a degraded puff produced inconsistent powder distribution and could introduce bacteria to the compact's interior. This advice, which appeared in the accessories care sections of at least 3 major beauty features in 1951, is the kind of practical detail that distinguishes the beauty editorial at its best from mere product advocacy. It assumes a reader who intends to use her objects properly over time and who deserves the information required to do so. The compact as a form of personal signature, the way a woman's choice of case communicated something about her aesthetic sensibility, her economic position, and her relationship to beauty as an enterprise, was a theme that ran through the accessories editorial of the period without always becoming explicit. A woman who carried a Stratton powder door compact in navy blue enamel was making different choices from a woman who carried a Coty spun tin or an Elgin American engraved case, and the other women in her social circle were reading those choices. In this sense, the compact participated in the same system of social legibility as the hat and the gloves and the quality of the handbag, a system in which every visible object carried information that the socially literate observer decoded automatically and used to form a preliminary assessment that might or might not be revised upon further acquaintance. There is a remarkable passage in a 1951 Good Housekeeping beauty feature about a woman described as the editor's mother, who had carried the same Coty compact, rose gold case, powder blue enamel lid since her wedding in 1934, and who had the compact's interior refinished at a jeweler when the original mirror clouded from age, a repair operation that cost more than the compact had originally. The editor's point was ostensibly about the economics of quality purchase versus disposable product. But what the passage actually communicates, and what the editor perhaps intended to communicate without quite stating it, was something about the companionship of objects, the way a well-made thing, carried daily for 17 years, accumulates the gravity of all the moments through which it has travelled. The compact had been opened at a wartime hospital bedside and at a post-war celebration dinner, and at a graduation and at a funeral. It contained, metaphorically, all of those moments alongside the Coty powder. This is what the beauty editors of 1951 understood about the well-made compact. It was not a tool, it was a record. And when you opened it to check your appearance at a restaurant table, you were doing something that Charlotte Winchester was entirely right to call an announcement. Volume 8. Power and Puff Lipstick. The sentence appeared on the first page of the entertaining section of the May 1951 issue of Better Homes and Gardens, and it read as follows: "A husband's mood upon returning home in the evening is to an extent that may surprise the new homemaker, largely within her power to determine. Not partially within her power, not influenced by her actions, largely within her power." The entertaining editors, a category that overlapped almost completely with the beauty editors in the women's magazines of the period, since the management of one's appearance and the management of one's social environment were understood as complementary disciplines of the same essential project E, were making a claim about domestic causality that was on the surface a statement about cocktail hour preparation, and was beneath the surface a statement about the management of masculine emotional life as a core domestic responsibility. The practical instruction that followed this declaration, how to arrange the bar cart, how to prepare the canapés in advance, how to position oneself so as to appear refreshed and composed at 5:30 regardless of what the preceding 8 hours of housework had involved, was delivered with the same systematic authority as the skincare instruction in the adjacent beauty section. The bar cart itself was a mid-century domestic object of considerable symbolic and practical significance that the entertaining editors of 1951 treated with the reverence usually reserved for furniture of genuine pedigree. The ideal cart, as specified across multiple magazine features of the period, was a wheeled construction of chrome or brass tubing supporting 2 or 3 tiers of glass or lacquered wood, positioned in the living room where it could be both functionally accessible and aesthetically prominent. It was to be stocked at minimum with the following: rye whiskey, bourbon, scotch, gin, dry vermouth, sweet vermouth, a bottle of quality sherry, tonic water, club soda, a small jar of cocktail olives, a jar of maraschino cherries, cocktail onions, a shaker, a long stirring spoon, a measuring jigger, a strainer, a small ice bucket, and crystal glasses of 3 types: the standard old-fashioned or rocks glass, the V-shaped cocktail glass, and the taller highball glass. This list was not presented as the aspirational maximum. It was presented as the workable minimum for a hostess who intended to accommodate her husband's guests with competence. The crystal glassware question was one the beauty and entertaining editors of 1951 addressed with particular attention to both quality and presentation. The argument for lead crystal over pressed glass was not merely aesthetic, though the aesthetic argument was made clearly. Crystal produced a bell tone when tapped, caught, and refracted light in a way that animated the liquid it contained and communicated to the guest that her host had invested genuine care in the physical environment of the evening. But the entertaining editors also made a functional argument. The thin walls of hand-blown crystal kept chilled drinks colder for longer, distributed heat from a warm brandy snifter differently, and allowed the aromatic compounds of spirits, particularly bourbon and single malt scotch, which were being treated by 1951's better entertaining columns as subjects of genuine connoisseurship, to volatilize more efficiently. Whether this last claim was accurate is a question for sensory scientists. What is accurate is that the entertaining editors of 1951 were making scientific-sounding arguments in support of elegant objects, which is a persuasive technique that has not diminished in effectiveness over the subsequent 7 decades. Deviled eggs were the appetizer that appeared in more 1951 cocktail hour features than any other single item, and their prominence reveals something interesting about the intersection of convenience, elegance, and the specific social dynamics of the suburban cocktail hour. They could be prepared entirely in advance and kept in the refrigerator until needed, a practical advantage that the entertaining editors consistently flagged, since the hostess who disappeared into the kitchen for extended periods during her own cocktail hour was failing at the essential social task, which was to circulate, facilitate conversation, and create the atmosphere of effortless hospitality. They were eaten in 2 or 3 bites without implements, requiring neither fork nor knife and therefore no additional cutlery on the cocktail table. They were visually attractive in the idiom of the period. The pale yellow filling piped decoratively and dusted with paprika, presented on a platter that the hostess could carry through the gathering. And they tasted, if properly made, genuinely good, which is a consideration that the entertaining editors mentioned but did not treat as the primary criterion. But what came next would rewrite everything the beauty press thought it understood about the woman reading these pages. The entertainment features of 1951 included remarkably sophisticated instruction on what we would now call the hosting experience, the management of conversation flow, the engineering of guest introductions, the strategic deployment of food and drink to smooth social transitions. The entertaining editor of McCall's published a piece in the January 1951 issue titled The Architecture of an Evening, which divided the cocktail party's progression into 4 distinct phases: the arrival and introduction period, the standing circulation period, the transition to seated arrangement, and the dispersal why, and specified the hostess's responsibilities in each phase with the precision of a stage director's prompt book. In the arrival period, the hostess was to have already spoken briefly with each guest before the arrival of the next, so that no one stood alone waiting to be collected. In the circulation period, she was to move through the room in a pattern that passed within conversational range of each group at intervals of approximately 12 minutes, short enough that no group felt neglected, long enough that each group had time to develop its own dynamic before she arrived to refresh it. The conversation management instruction was particularly nuanced. The entertaining editors understood that the cocktail party was not simply a gathering of people who enjoyed each other's company, but a social structure with the specific purpose of producing pleasurable interaction between people who might not, left entirely to their own devices, manage it without assistance. The hostess was the mechanism through which the pleasure was produced, and her primary tool was the introduction, specifically the introduction accompanied by the conversational opener, the brief characterization of each party to the other that gave them a subject to begin with. This is Dorothy, who has just returned from 6 weeks in Italy and knows more about Roman cooking than anyone else I know, was an introduction that gave Dorothy a social identity relevant to the evening's gathering and gave Dorothy's new conversational partner an obvious and specific opening question. The beauty and entertaining editors were, in this instruction, teaching something that modern social psychologists call facilitated connection, and that the hostess of 1951 simply called good manners. The hostess's own appearance at the cocktail hour received specific editorial attention that intersected with the beauty content in revealing ways. The principle of the cocktail hour change. The transformation from whatever day garment the hostess had been wearing into something that signaled the transition from domestic work to social occasion was widely endorsed in the entertaining editorial of the period, not primarily for its effect on the guests, but for its effect on the hostess herself. The editors noted with consistent psychological acuity that the act of changing clothes, refreshing one's hair, and applying a final layer of lipstick before the first guest arrived produced a shift in the host's own register of self-presentation that made genuine hospitality easier to sustain. You could not fully perform the relaxed, composed, glad-to-see-you quality of the good hostess while still smelling of the vegetables you had been preparing for the past 2 hours. The change of clothes was not vanity. It was theatrical preparation, and hidden in the fine print of the very next column was an admission that no editor of the era expected her readers to catch. The bar cart choreography, who served whom, in what sequence, with what attention to preference and dietary consideration, was covered with a specificity that suggests the entertaining editors had either attended or run a great many cocktail hours and had thought hard about what made them work. The standard protocol for the Suburban cocktail hour of 1951 had the husband making the initial round of drinks while the hostess circulated with appetizers, a division of labor that assigned the husband a visible social role and freed the hostess to manage the room. The second round fell to the hostess, allowing her to check in individually with each guest, assess the conversation dynamics, and make the small adjustments, rearranging a grouping, drawing a quiet guest into a more active circle, refreshing the appetizer tray that kept the gathering at its best. This was management. It was complex, skilled, invisible management, and the entertaining editors of 1951 were its most articulate theorists. The canapé was the cocktail hour's most demanding technical challenge, and the entertaining editors who covered it in 1951 brought to the subject the analytical energy of people who had presided over enough failed canapé platters to understand exactly where the failures occurred. The structural integrity of the canapé, which depended on the relationship between the base, whether toast round or cracker or cucumber slice, the spread or adhesive layer that prevented the topping from migrating, and the topping itself, which was required to be both visually attractive and mechanically stable enough to survive being carried on a tray through a living room without losing its architectural coherence, was a genuine engineering problem that the better entertaining editors addressed with the seriousness it deserved. The toast base needed to be cut from bread that was not so fresh that it absorbed moisture from the spread and collapsed, and not so stale that it shattered on the bite and scattered topping across the guest's clothing. The spread needed to extend to the edges, but not beyond them. The topping needed to be placed with deliberate attention to visual center and proportion. The sourcing and preparation of cocktail hour food had been transformed by the post-war expansion of the American processed food industry, and the entertaining editors of 1951 navigated the new landscape of convenience products with editorial positions that were not always internally consistent. On one hand, the editors who wrote about the craft of entertaining celebrated the skills of preparation from primary ingredients, the deviled eggs made from scratch, the canapé spread made from fresh ingredients rather than from a commercially prepared base. On the other hand, the same magazines were running substantial advertising revenue from the manufacturers of exactly those commercially prepared bases, and the editorial coverage of the convenience food category was correspondingly warm. The result was a cocktail hour cuisine advice system that simultaneously valued from-scratch preparation as the ideal and acknowledged, with varying degrees of explicitness, that the convenient alternative was a reasonable accommodation that the practical hostess should not be ashamed to make. The question of ice management, which the entertaining editors treated with a thoroughness that suggests ice failure was a genuine concern at the mid-century Suburban cocktail hour, reveals the degree to which the physical infrastructure of the era shaped the entertaining possibilities available to the average hostess. The standard domestic refrigerator of 1951 produced ice in metal ice cube trays that held between 8 and 12 cubes per tray and required 6 to 8 hours to freeze from empty. A hostess preparing for a cocktail party of 8 to 12 guests needed to begin ice production planning at least 24 hours in advance, running multiple freeze cycles to accumulate the quantity required. The insulated ice bucket, which the entertaining editors recommended as a standard bar cart component, would maintain ice in usable condition for approximately 90 minutes in a warm room, after which the bucket's contents became, depending on one's tolerance, a weaker or stronger diluting agent in the drinks it was still technically serving. The specific choreography of the cocktail party's music was covered by at least two entertaining editors in 1951 as a dimension of the sensory environment that the hostess was responsible for managing alongside the visual and culinary elements. The phonograph, and 1951 was the year in which the long-playing vinyl record at 33 1/3 revolutions per minute had been available for just 3 years and was displacing the fragile shellac 78 in middle-class homes with increasing speed, offered the hostess the ability to program a sonic environment of between 20 and 45 minutes of uninterrupted music per side, which was a significant advance over the shellac era's 3 to 4 minutes per side and the constant attention it required. The editors who addressed music selection recommended what they called background music, a category that by 1951 was becoming a commercial genre with specific aesthetic parameters, orchestral arrangements of popular songs at moderate tempo, played at a volume that allowed conversation without effort, while providing the acoustic texture that prevented the silences between conversations from feeling abrupt. The recommendation was, in essence, an early formulation of the concept that subsequent decades would call ambient music, and the entertaining editors arrived at it from purely social rather than aesthetic considerations. What the Cocktail Hour editorial of 1951 was documenting, even as it described the placement of the olive jar and the temperature of the ice bucket, was a form of domestic social labor that was sophisticated, demanding, and systematically undervalued. The hostess, who engineered a successful cocktail hour, who had prepared all food in advance, staged the room, arranged the bar cart, refreshed her appearance, greeted each guest with genuine warmth, managed the conversation with invisible skill, and maintained for the duration of the evening the impression of effortless pleasure, had performed work of a complexity that would have been recognized immediately in a professional context, and that went almost entirely unacknowledged in the domestic one. The entertaining editors gave this work its due, if not its name. They documented it. They systematized it. They treated it as the practice of a discipline that could be taught and improved. In doing so, they created something that can be read now as a monument to skilled work that deserved better recognition than it received. The ice was perfectly chilled. The glasses rang like bells. And the woman who made all of it possible had been described in the culture at large as simply at home. Volume 9. Power and Puff Lipstick, the 12-page wardrobe guide published in the March 1951 issue of McCall's opened with a sentence that the editors clearly intended as motivation, and that reads today as the opening line of a compliance document: "A well-dressed woman is never underdressed." The implication was that overdressing, wearing something more formal or more elaborate than the occasion strictly required, was preferable to the social infraction of insufficient dressing, and that the woman who erred on the side of more was making a statement about her own seriousness, while the woman who erred on the side of less was making a statement about her disregard for the social expectations of others. This principle organized the 12 pages that followed, which specified in table form and accompanying prose the correct garment for every social occasion that the McCall's editors could anticipate a reader encountering: morning errands, afternoon bridge, formal luncheon, business appointment, informal dinner, formal dinner, theatre, cocktail party, outdoor sporting occasion, Sunday church, and 11 additional categories. Each category had a corresponding list of required and prohibited elements. Gloves appeared in the required column for all but 2 of the categories. For those 2, outdoor sporting occasion and casual summer morning errands, they appeared in the advisable column, which was the McCall's wardrobe guide's way of saying that their absence was not a violation but was noted. The foundation garment was the architectural substrate of the 1951 silhouette, and the beauty and fashion editors who covered it did so with the earnest technical vocabulary of structural engineering, because structural engineering was precisely what they were describing. The new look that Christian Dior had introduced in 1947, the nipped waist, the full skirt, the rounded shoulder, the emphasized hip and bust, had established a silhouette that required, for most of the women who wore it, significant physical infrastructure that was not provided by the natural body alone. The girdle, an elasticized garment that extended from approximately the natural waist to the upper thigh, compressing the abdomen and hip into the smooth, unbroken curve the new silhouette required, was not optional equipment in 1951. It was the foundation. The fashion editors understood this and addressed it directly. Before discussing any other element of the dressed body, they discussed the foundation garment, because the foundation garment determined whether the clothes above it would work. The specific garments involved in the 1951 foundation layer were more various than is generally remembered. The all-in-one foundation, which combined girdle and brassiere in a single garment and shaped the body from above the bust to below the hip, was the most comprehensive option and was recommended by fashion editors for women wearing formal or heavily constructed garments where any disruption of the smooth bodyline would telegraph through the outer fabric. The separate girdle and brassiere combination was the standard for daywear, with the brassiere style pointed, wired, heavily engineered, constructed to produce a specific conical or hemispherical breast shape that bore little relationship to the natural breast, coordinated with the girdle to produce a consistent body reading from shoulder to hip. The strapless brassiere, which the fashion editors covered extensively in 1951 as a technical achievement that had only recently become reliably functional, required internal boning and structural reinforcement that in the better examples represented genuine textile engineering. The crinoline petticoat, which held the full skirt of the new look silhouette at its proper volume, was a garment whose construction was treated by the McCall's sewing editors. The fashion coverage of the period was inseparable from its sewing instruction, since a significant proportion of the women who consumed fashion editorial also sewed a portion of their wardrobes, with the same technical attention given to tailored garments. The most functional petticoats of 1951 were multi-tiered constructions of net or organdy on a cotton or taffeta foundation, with each tier starched to a different degree of stiffness and sewn at intervals calculated to produce an even bell curve of volume from the waist to the hem. A badly constructed petticoat, one whose tiers were uneven or whose starch had distributed inconsistently, would produce a silhouette that bunched at unpredictable points and collapsed in others, undermining the smooth architectural line that the entire ensemble was built to achieve. The fashion editors who ran petticoat construction features in their sewing sections in 1951 were not writing about craft projects. They were writing about structural engineering problems with approximately 150 yards of net fabric. But what came next would rewrite everything the beauty press thought it understood about the woman reading these pages. The glove question consumed more editorial column inches in the 1951 fashion press than any other single accessory, partly because gloves were the most rule-governed element of the complete dressed body, and partly because the rules were intricate enough to generate the kind of educational content that readers found genuinely useful. The basic principle that gloves were required for formal occasions and strongly recommended for semi-formal ones, that they were to be worn or carried rather than placed on a table or left in a handbag, that their length corresponded to the length of the sleeve and the formality of the occasion, was established in every fashion guide of the period. But the application of this principle to specific situations produced an abundance of detail that the editors addressed methodically. Short white gloves in cotton or fabric were correct for day wear and afternoon events. Longer gloves, the shorty ending below the elbow, the mid-elbow length, the opera glove extending to the upper arm, were calibrated to evening formality and to sleeve length in a complex system that the fashion editors charted in diagrams. The removal of gloves at dinner, when to remove them, in what order, what to do with them once removed, was covered in the etiquette sections with the seriousness due a technical skill, because performing this transition poorly or at the wrong moment was, in the social grammar of 1951, the clothing equivalent of using the wrong fork. The hat was the garment that gave the 1951 fashion editor the greatest expressive pleasure, and that has most thoroughly vanished from contemporary everyday dress in a way that makes the editorial energy devoted to it in 1951 somewhat surreal to read. The hat was required for church, for formal afternoon occasions, for any engagement that could be described as in town or uptown, and for social calls. It was the accessory that completed the public appearance of the dressed body in the way that the compact completed the face. Not merely an addition, but a finishing element without which the presentation was, by the standards of the period, incomplete. The spring 1951 hat features in Vogue and Harper's Bazaar covered the season's shapes: the shallow dome, the side-tilted disc, the elaborately structured confection of straw and grosgrain ribbon, with the vocabulary of sculpture criticism, discussing form and proportion and the relationship of the hat's silhouette to the face below it. The face-shape charts that had appeared in the makeup sections were reprised in the millinery sections to explain why a particular hat that flattered an oval face might overwhelm a round one. The day versus evening distinction that the fashion editors of 1951 enforced with almost jurisdictional authority was not arbitrary. It encoded a social logic about the appropriate visibility of female display in different contexts of the day. The quieter, more functional dress of the active daytime woman calibrated to her practical engagement with the world, versus the more elaborate and deliberate display of the evening woman dressing for the social occasion in which appearance was part of the explicit purpose. The fashion editors who specified that bare arms were acceptable at an evening party but not at a daytime luncheon, that jewelry could be more elaborate after 6 o'clock, that fabrics could be richer and colors deeper and heels higher in the evening than the afternoon, were not simply listing rules. They were articulating a theory of social time that divided the day into zones with different aesthetic requirements, and a woman who dressed correctly for each zone was demonstrating her fluency in the social grammar of her moment. And hidden in the fine print of the very next column was an admission that no editor of the era expected her readers to catch. The wardrobe capsule concept, the idea that a small number of well-chosen, versatile garments could generate a larger number of complete outfits through strategic combination, was present in the 1951 fashion editorial in a surprisingly sophisticated form. The McCall's 12-page wardrobe guide included, near its end, a section on the foundation wardrobe that specified 8 to 12 garments in a coordinated palette from which most social occasions could be dressed. The principle was efficiency, spending more on fewer, better garments rather than more on more garments of lesser quality, and it was framed as both financial wisdom and aesthetic coherence. A wardrobe in which every garment could be worn with every other garment in the collection reduced the cognitive load of dressing, the editorial argued, and allowed the wearer to dress correctly and efficiently for any occasion from the same small set of pieces. Today, this concept is sold to us as slow fashion and curated wardrobing and the capsule wardrobe, with the same 8 to 12-piece framework that the McCall's editors were recommending in the spring of 1951. The impulse toward elegant economy in dress is not a contemporary invention. It was page 9 of the wardrobe guide. The shoes occupied a specific position in the 1951 dress taxonomy that the fashion editors addressed with particular attention to the relationship between heel height and social occasion, a relationship that was, in the dress code of the period, as rule-governed as the glove-length system. The low-heeled or flat shoe was correct for morning and casual country wear, for active outdoor occasions, and for situations involving substantial walking. The mid-heel, usually between 1 and 2 inches, was the standard for daytime town wear, for the office, and for most afternoon social occasions. The higher heel, the 3-inch court shoe that the fashion press of 1951 was covering with enthusiasm as the natural complement to the new look's slender ankle and full skirt, was correct for cocktail parties, dinners, theatre, and any occasion that took place primarily in stationary social settings where the comfort sacrifice of the high heel was offset by the visual contribution it made to the overall silhouette. The editors who covered shoes in 1951 were aware that the aesthetic argument and the comfort argument were in genuine tension, and several of them addressed this honestly by recommending that women who needed to be on their feet for extended periods choose the social occasion that made the most demands on their time carefully, an advice strategy that acknowledged the real physical cost of high heel wearing without questioning the aesthetic desirability of the result. The handbag's relationship to the season's wardrobe was covered in a specific editorial tradition of the 1951 fashion press, the seasonal bag feature, that served as a guide through the transitions of color, material, and silhouette that the fashion industry cycled through with a regularity that the well-dressed woman was expected to observe. Spring and summer called for the lighter materials, canvas, straw, white or cream leather, while autumn and winter required the deeper, richer materials of the darker season. The shape of the bag tracked the shape of the season's silhouette. In 1951, when the silhouette emphasized the smooth, rounded hip of the new look, the bag was typically a smooth box shape or a structured round, nothing that added visual volume at the hip or interrupted the smooth curve of the outer garment. The clutch, carried under the arm or in the hand, was the correct bag for evening, where the handbag's bulk needed to be minimal and its surface as elegant as possible. The color coordination system that the fashion editors of 1951 promoted with quiet insistence organized the complete dressed body into a chromatic harmony that extended from hat through shoes, with every visible element of the ensemble in a defined relationship, matching, complementing, or deliberately contrasting tone with every other element. A woman in a navy wool suit carried a navy bag, wore navy shoes, and finished with either a navy hat or a hat in the exact cream of her gloves. The discipline of this system was, in the hands of the editors who promoted it, not merely aesthetic discipline, but a form of compositional intelligence, an understanding that the clothed body is a visual object that can be organized according to the same principles of proportion, repetition, and focal point that organize any other kind of designed composition. What the fashion editorial of 1951 was negotiating in its careful rules about gloves and hat lengths and evening versus daytime fabric was the relationship between constraint and identity. The woman who dressed correctly for every occasion according to the McCall's guide was performing a social competence that was also, in the coded language of the era, a declaration of character. She understood the rules, which meant she had been taught them or had learned them, which meant she belonged to or had joined the class of women for whom these rules were a natural environment. The rules were also, it must be acknowledged, a structure within which creativity had to operate rather than one that eliminated creativity entirely. The best-dressed women of 1951, as observed by the fashion editors who covered them, were not the most obedient rule followers. They were the women who understood the rules well enough to bend them with conviction. The slightly unexpected hat choice, the gloves in an unorthodox color, the evening fabric worn to a daytime occasion with enough confidence to make the informality seem intentional. The constraint was real, but within it, as always, there was room. Fixunder Volume 10, Power and Puff. Lipstick. The most extraordinary piece of intelligence about red lipstick to emerge from the declassified government archives of the Second World War is this. The War Department had made a deliberate policy decision to ensure the continued manufacture and distribution of red lipstick to American civilian women during the war years, even as other cosmetic materials were restricted or redirected toward military use. Not because the officials involved had strong views about feminine beauty, because the intelligence they received consistently indicated that the maintenance of cosmetic normalcy, the red lip most specifically, since it was the most visually dramatic and most culturally recognizable cosmetic item in the American feminine arsenal, kept civilian female morale in a functional range that military planners believed to be strategically important. The beauty editors of 1951 knew this. Several of them said so directly, in the matter-of-fact tone of people who had lived through the war and understood that the connections between lipstick and psychological resilience they had experienced personally were not metaphorical. The red lip, entering the peacetime moment of 1951, carried this history in its pigment. The chemistry of the red lipstick of 1951 was more complex and more interesting than the simple image of a pressed stick of waxy color suggests. And the beauty editors who covered cosmetic formulation in any depth gave it its due. The base of the standard lipstick of the period was castor oil, a highly viscous, slow-setting oil that provided the smooth application properties the formula required, combined with varying ratios of candelilla wax, beeswax, and carnauba wax to produce a texture that was firm enough to remain in its bullet form at room temperature but soft enough to transfer cleanly to the lip surface without dragging. The pigment that produced the red was primarily carmine, a dye derived from the dried and ground bodies of the Dactylopius coccus insect, a cochineal beetle cultivated in Peru and the Canary Islands, suspended in the oil base in concentrations that determined whether the finished color would be a sheer tint, a mid-opacity statement, or the fully saturated, opaque red that constituted the classic bold lip. The lanolin content varied by manufacturer and was a significant quality marker. Formulas with higher lanolin content were richer, more moisturizing, and clung to the lip more persistently, which was either an advantage or a disadvantage depending on whether you were buying the lipstick for its longevity or its replaceability. Revlon, which by 1951 was the dominant force in the American mass-market cosmetics industry and had built that dominance largely on the back of a lipstick and nail polish marketing strategy of almost military precision, was preparing what would become one of the most famous single advertisements in the history of American beauty, the Fire and Ice campaign that launched in the autumn of 1952. But in 1951, the groundwork was already in place. Revlon's marketing under Charles Revson, a man whose commercial instincts were remarkable and whose personal temperament was, by all historical accounts, considerably more difficult, had established a template for lipstick marketing that the rest of the industry would spend decades imitating. The color with a name that told a story, the campaign that asked the consumer to identify herself through her choice, the implicit argument that the lipstick was not a product but a position. When the beauty editors of 1951 reviewed new Revlon lipstick colors, they were reviewing not simply a formula in a metal tube, but a piece of copy, a social statement, a small autobiography that the consumer purchased and wore on her face. Tangy, the brand that had made its reputation in the 1930s on the color that changes on your lips formulation, a lipstick containing a pigment base that reacted with the individual chemistry of the wearer's lip surface to produce a subtly personalized shade rather than a uniform color, was by 1951 navigating the transition from its earlier identity as a natural alternative to bold color toward the increasingly vivid palette that the post-war moment demanded. The Tangy Natural, which had been the brand's signature product for 2 decades, was a genuinely innovative formulation that the beauty editors treated as a category unto itself, not the dramatic red of the Revlon line, not the neutral beige that was beginning to find a market at the upper end of the cosmetic spectrum, but something organic, variable, and personalized in a way that resonated with a strand of mid-century beauty thinking that valued the appearance of enhancement rather than its visibility. The beauty editors who covered Tangy in 1951 often paired their discussion of it with discussion of what it was not, a way of defining the bold lip by contrast even while reviewing the subtle one. But what came next would rewrite everything the beauty press thought it understood about the woman reading these pages. Hazel Bishop's Kiss-Proof lipstick, which had launched in 1950 and was being refined and expanded through 1951, represented perhaps the most significant technical development in the lipstick category of the decade. The formula, which Bishop developed herself from her background in organic chemistry, she had worked as a chemist before her cosmetics career and brought to lipstick formulation a laboratory rigor that most beauty product development of the era conspicuously lacked, used a different polymer base from the standard wax formulation that produced a film on the lip surface that resisted transfer far more effectively than anything previously available. The beauty editors who tested it were, by the accounts of the period, genuinely astonished. The standard test for lipstick in 1951 editorial was the blotting paper test. You applied the lipstick, pressed a tissue against the lips, and photographed the tissue imprint that remained. With standard wax lipsticks, the tissue imprint was substantial. With Hazel Bishop's formula, it was minimal. The editors reported this with the enthusiasm of journalists who recognized that they were covering something genuinely new. The sociological history of the bold red lip that the beauty editors of 1951 were participating in without always explicitly naming was long, complicated, and significantly darker than the commercial cheerfulness of their Revlon reviews acknowledged. The association between visible cosmetic coloring, lip paint, rouge, visible powder, and sexual availability or moral looseness had been a recurring theme in Western social discourse since at least the medieval period, and as recently as the 1920s, the painted woman remained a figure of moral suspicion in significant quarters of American public life. The Second World War had done substantial work on this cultural association. When women working in munitions factories and military support roles wore red lipstick as a deliberate assertion of femininity maintained under difficult conditions, and they did, extensively documented in the photography of the period, the moral reading of the bold lip became considerably more complicated. A woman could be patriotic and wear red lipstick. A woman could be capable and wear red lipstick. The lipstick was no longer the property of a single social meaning. The 1951 beauty editors who wrote about red lipstick were, whether they intended to or not, writing about this transition. Their instruction, how to choose the correct red for your skin undertone, how to line the lips for maximum definition, how to blot for longevity, how to refresh throughout the day, was technical instruction in the same sense that the cold cream features and the eyeliner guides were technical instruction. But the language around the red lip carried an additional charge that the other categories did not. The red lip was described repeatedly and by multiple editors in terms that referenced power, protection, and the relationship between appearance and inner state. Choose your red. wrote one Vogue beauty editor in a November 1951 piece on the season's lipstick palette, the way you choose your position in an argument, for what it says, not only for what it looks like. This was remarkable editorial copy for 1951. The lipstick as argument, the lip as position, the color as statement, not ornament. And hidden in the fine print of the very next column was an admission that no editor of the era expected her readers to catch. Max Factor's contribution to the red lip story of 1951 was the formulation of a range of reds calibrated to the color system they had developed for Technicolor film photography, a system that specified which pigment combinations read as red under the specific light frequencies of the Technicolor process and which reds shifted on film to orange or pink. The practical upshot was a range of lipstick colors whose Technicolor tested status gave them a kind of technical authority in the beauty press. If they were correct under the most demanding and most scientifically analyzed lighting conditions available, the implicit argument ran they would be correct under any conditions. The beauty editors reported the Technicolor affiliation with appreciation since it provided them with a vocabulary, the camera-correct red, the studio-tested formula that made lipstick recommendation sound like the result of rigorous testing rather than personal preference, which was in 1951 the highest form of editorial credibility. What the beauty editors of 1951 were ultimately saying, page by page through their columns on cold cream and corrective foundation and liquid liner and pin curls and charm school posture and powder compacts and cocktail canapes and petticoat construction and glove lengths and kiss-proof lipstick was something that had no single sentence capable of containing it. They were saying, this is worth your attention. They were saying, these practices constitute a domain of knowledge that deserves to be treated seriously, documented carefully, and transmitted from those who understand it to those who are learning it. They were saying your face, your body, your appearance, your social performance, your domestic artistry, all of it is legitimate territory for intelligent, sustained inquiry. They were saying, in the only language available to them in the cultural moment of 1951, that the women who were their readers were worth writing for with seriousness and skill and a genuine respect for the complexity of what those women were doing and being asked to do. The specific red that the beauty editors of 1951 most frequently recommended was not, it turned out, the pure spectral red that the word red suggests to the contemporary eye. The most flattering lipstick reds of the period, the reds that the editors described as universally compatible as the red that works for everyone, were almost uniformly blue reds rather than orange reds. Pigments with enough blue in their base to read as red against the warmth of the human lip surface rather than pulling orange, and whose blue undertone had the additional effect of making the teeth appear whiter by contrast. The editors who explained this distinction were teaching a kind of practical color theory that their readers absorbed and applied with gratifying specificity, the woman with warm skin undertones who had been applying a yellow-red and finding the result unflattering learned from this instruction, why, and could correct it in a single drugstore visit. This was beauty education at its most functionally useful, and it produced in the reader the particular satisfaction of a principle understood rather than merely a product recommendation followed. The application technique for the classic red lip was addressed in 1951 editorial with a degree of precision that suggests the editors understood they were teaching a skill rather than describing an aesthetic preference. The foundation of the technique was the lip liner, a wax-based pencil in a shade close to the natural lip color, or close to the lipstick being applied, used to trace the outer edge of the lip before any color was applied. The liner served two functions. It prevented the lipstick from bleeding into the fine lines around the lip, which was particularly relevant for the fully saturated red that had the most pigment to migrate, and it provided a guide for the lipstick application that allowed for correction and definition of the lip shape before the more difficult-to-control lipstick was introduced. After lining, the lipstick was applied from the center of the upper lip outward to the corners, repeated on the lower lip, and then the lips were pressed together and the surplus blotted with a single layer of tissue. A second application applied on top of the blotted first produced the degree of saturation and longevity that the Hazel-Bishop formula was approximating chemically, but that the layering technique achieved mechanically. The red lip closed the editorial year of 1951 in the December gift guide features with the same authority it had opened it in the January resolutions columns, and this circularity was not accidental. The beauty editors understood that the red lipstick was both the beginning and the completion of the beauty project they had been documenting all year, the product that summarized the era's relationship to appearance, power, and the particular kind of self-assertion that was available to women within the constraints of the moment. It was armor in the truest sense, not protection from the world, but projection into it. Today, the red lipstick remains what it was in 1951. The cosmetic that operates most powerfully as a symbol, that carries the most meaning beyond its function, that is most explicitly discussed in terms that exceed the purely aesthetic. It remains the item most frequently cited by women who have survived difficult experiences as the first cosmetic they return to when they felt ready to return. It remains the color that beauty editors who are still writing in different formats and through different platforms, but with the same combination of technical instruction and cultural observation that their 1951 predecessors practiced, treat as worthy of the most thoughtful prose they can produce. The armor is still in circulation. The war for which it was issued has changed shape many times since 1951. But the women wearing it understood, as they always have, exactly what they were carrying into the room.